Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Hugh and I'm from Alberta in Western Canada, where the exquisite landscape here encompasses mountains, prairies, desert badlands and coniferous forests. My family is from Lethbridge, which has a very small town feel about it, as people are very congenial and friendly in this part of the world. But there is the added convenience of close access to all the local amenities that you can find when you're in an urban metropolis, from restaurants, coffee shops and schools. The climate in Lethbridge consists of pleasant warm summers and mild winters due to its close proximity to the Canadian Rockies. Growing up, we lived in the southern part of town, in the Cooley Creek neighbourhood, in a ranch-style home, in a rectangular U-shaped house, with whitewashed walls, low-pitched grey roofs, with wide eaves and a large patio area, which is quite commonplace. I grew up here with both my loving, attentive parents and older sister Letitia, and I can honestly say we really did have an idyllic childhood, with so much outdoor spaces where we could explore, camp and hike, as there was an abundance of recreational activities to enjoy and appreciate, so we were never short of interesting things to do as a family. My bizarre, curious story begins when I was going on a field camp with about 19 other boys in my year at school with our biology teacher, Mr. Anderson, and I was incredibly excited. I was about 11 years old at the time, which was in 1996. Mr. Anderson was the most beloved teacher in our entire school. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that everybody loved him, and even the parents thought he was an incredibly cool dude. He was quirky and eccentric, with a great sense of humour. At school he transformed every single biology lesson into a work of art and made our studies become so alive that every boy in the class would hang on to his every word as if it was the gospel. We listened to him speak with such passion and unbridled enthusiasm of the natural world, which was so contagious that every boy in our class, irrespective of their academic prowess, always ended up getting excellent grades. Mr. Anderson was one of those exceptional teachers and made no apologies for his unconventional teaching style. And even the headmaster of our school confessed that if there were indeed more teachers like Mr. Anderson around, there would be absolutely no failed pupils. Mr. Anderson was in his early 60s and was strong, well-built, athletic and very nimble. He was a good-looking gentleman and was one of those people that actually improved with age, much like a good wine. He had silvery hair and bright hazel eyes. He told me once he'd never been married because in his younger days he would jet-set all over the globe on intrepid, exciting adventures. He didn't want to be tied down with a family and kids at that stage of his life. Whilst all his friends were getting married and raising families, Mr. Anderson was climbing mountains, exploring rainforests, visiting remote villages and indigenous people, and some of the stories he shared with us about his exciting adventures were quite simply mind-blowing. Mr. Anderson regularly organised about 3 field trips a year with his classes. They weren't compulsory, of course, but every boy in our class would never turn down a camping trip with Mr. Anderson. You'd have to be mad to do so, because invariably you'd be missing out on one hell of an adventure. So there we were, out in the idyllic natural world, camping with Mr. Anderson, our all-time favourite teacher. We pitched 6 4-man tents, one specifically for Mr. Anderson to occupy, while every other tent was inhabited by 4 boys per tent. We prepared a large fire pit and placed a couple of loose tree limbs around the area for seating purposes, and they were very comfortable indeed. Our campsite overlooked a ravishing aquamarine lake, which gets its exquisite turquoise colour from the retraction of rock flour that flows into the lake during the summer months, so very typical of lakes here in the Rockies, most especially the famous Lake Louise, which is indeed something spectacular to behold. The glistening lake that surrounded our campsite looked like a sparkling, glittering sapphire, reflecting all the panoramic views of the mountains, the clouds, glaciers and trees upon its gleaming surface like a shimmering mirror. This precious jewel was set against a panoramic backdrop of the most majestic silhouettes of tall, imposing mountains with such rugged, interesting triangular ridges that in themselves were like great works of sculpture. Then there were the tall, alpine, verdant trees that were dotted together in sumptuous carpets of green. Our camp overlooked the lake and was surrounded on either side by an undulating prairie filled with green turf and pretty spring flowers, and on the rear of our campsite were forests of trees that stretched back for many miles, with hiking trails literally everywhere. We couldn't have asked to be in a more sublime, idyllic and tranquil place, and it's so easy to be completely mesmerised by these incredible views. On the first day of our trip, Mr. Anderson gave us each our own glass bottle and asked us to collect a living insect so we could discuss what it was that we'd actually found. And so off we went to search for our insects, teaming up with one other person on our search. My partner was Matt, who was my very best friend in school, so it was naturally reasonable that we would team up together. Matt collected a lady beetle, and I found the most exquisite butterfly and placed it in a screw-cap bottle with air holes and a few flowers to sit on. Before long we were discussing all the insects in detail, from bugs to grasshoppers and centipedes. "Why did you choose a butterfly, Hugh?" Mr. Anderson asked me. "Well, sir," I said, "I think they're rather beautiful. I like the fact that they actually metamorphosize. They go from being a caterpillar that is limited in its movements to a period of time spent in a cocoon, only to emerge from their confinement totally transformed. I like that, sir. I like the fact that the butterfly can fly over great distances, and they're free. If I were an insect, sir, I would definitely choose to be a butterfly." "Well put," said Mr. Anderson. "I couldn't have put it better myself. What about you, Matty? Why did you choose a lady beetle?" "Well, sir," said Matt, looking very, very serious, "ladybugs are very, very lucky. One day my mother found a ladybug on her handbag, and later in the day, sir, she came into some very good news about a sizable inheritance that she hadn't been expecting to receive from an aunt of hers. She didn't believe the aunt even liked her. Another time, sir, there was a ladybug on our car, and my mother ran through a red light, and the officer let her off with a warning, and she didn't have to pay a fine. So they are very lucky, sir. I also like the red colour and the black dots. I think they're also pretty." "Well, that's very interesting, Matt. I did like your definition." So after everybody had discussed the insects that they had caught in great detail, as usual it would seem that Mr. Anderson's rather quirky, outlandish and eccentric way of teaching had us all riveted and inspired. After we finished our discussions at great length, we finally set our insects free and then went for a long hike. We returned to camp to cook and prepare our meat over the fire pit. By this time we were famished. We watched in awe as the sun set over the valley, buttering it in tangerines, orange and golds, and after the soft orange contours ebbed and faded away, a mellow dusky darkness veiled our campsite, welcoming in the night, and before long the vast firmament was dotted with twinkling stars and a bright ivory moon, and we could hear the sounds of croaking frogs and singing crickets serenading the night with their soulful chatter. "It's a full moon," said Mr. Anderson, pointing towards the sky. "Did you know that people can be much more intense and very emotional during a full moon?" "No, sir," I said. "I didn't know that." "Oh, it's a scientific fact," reflected Mr. Anderson. "Even the hospitals know about it. There are many more emergencies on a full moon." Before long we were seated by a crackling fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. "Who has a good ghost story for us?" asked Mr. Anderson. We have to have a good story around the fire, as it's a prerequisite for a good camp." "I have, sir," said a young boy called Robbie. "Well, in a manner of speaking, I have." "Go on," said Mr. Anderson. "We're all waiting attentively." "Well, sir, my mother told me the story," he said. "It's a true story, sir. She was driving home in blizzard conditions, and it was very cold, and everything was carpeted in thick snow. The wind was panelling against my mother's window violently and beating against her car incredibly hard. All of a sudden she saw this young woman who was wearing a soft gown in these treacherous Arctic icy conditions, walking on her own in the snow. My mother was mortified to see this poor woman wearing a summery dress in these freezing weather conditions. My mother stopped her car immediately and offered the woman a lift. She said it was very odd because the woman was not even shivering with cold. She didn't even appear to be freezing. My mother said that the woman had a radiance about her, something that was really quite strange. She said it wasn't of this world, and began to talk to her in a musical voice, telling her all kinds of things about her life that she couldn't possibly have known. She told my mother to have a lot of courage because everything would be fine in the end. You see, my mother had breast cancer at the time, sir, and no one knew about her condition, but now she's fine, with no sign of cancer any more. But she said the car suddenly started to skid violently, sir. It lost traction. It should have rolled over the rocky ridge, but it didn't. And even though it didn't have guardrails at the time, it should have rolled over. But it actually just bounced back on its wheels and was back in the middle of the road as if nothing had happened, sir. She turned around to say to the woman, "Did you see that?" Because she knew what had just happened, but when she turned around, sir, the woman had just vanished, disappeared from her sight. She looked around, but the woman was nowhere to be seen, sir. My mother believes that it was an angel that protected her from having a very serious accident that could ultimately have killed her. She was certain about that, sir. "A wonderful story, Matt," said Mr. Anderson. "I do believe in angels. I believe that they can intervene in our lives, especially when they need to rescue us from perilous conditions, when it's not our time to leave the earth plane, that is." "Do you think our time is determined, Mr. Anderson?" I asked. "Oh, I do, son," he said. "I really do. But I could be wrong, of course." "Anyone else with a story?" he asked, "especially a ghost story." "Well, mine's a ghost story, sir, but it's not as nice as hers," said another boy called Cole. "My older sister Frederica is completely nuts, sir. She's so fascinated about ghosts. She actually frequents all those haunted places that you hear about, sir, and she regularly visits graveyards." "I can't say I blame her. I love graveyards," said Mr. Anderson. "I enjoy looking at those old gravestones from bygone days. I love reading the names on the graves and when the person died. It fascinates me for some bizarre reason." "Exactly like my sister, sir. She could spend hours in a graveyard and never get bored. One day she was meeting two of her friends in the graveyard. Other people meet in coffee shops, sir, but never my sister nor her friends. They like to chat around the graves, and they smoke cigarettes and drink swigs of cream brandy, which they pass around to each other while they chat and giggle and laugh. My mother thinks it's very inappropriate, distasteful and disrespectful, but my sister doesn't care. She says it's all a free world and she can do what she likes. She's nonconformist, sir, and very opinionated about absolutely everything." "I know what you mean," laughed Mr. Anderson. "A free spirit, that's what your sister is. And there's nothing wrong with being individualistic and unique. It makes the world a much more interesting place. It certainly does. Go on with your story, Cole. We're all listening." "Well, one day my sister got to the graveyard early. She saw this dark female figure floating above the grave and then merging into it and disappearing. She said it was the most sinister, evil-looking thing that she'd ever seen in her life, sir. This happened in broad daylight, not at night, so it freaked my sister out. But she waited for her friends to tell them what she'd seen. But they all wanted to stay at the graveyard in the hope that they'd see it too, because they thought it would be so exciting to observe. But the ghostly spectre never actually reappeared. But it doesn't end there, sir, because when my sister came home, my mother even noticed that the house seemed darker and heavier, almost oppressive if you like. Everyone felt it for an entire week, and even my father, who never notices anything, commented that something was really off at home. Everyone in the house felt uneasy and certain that they were being watched by unseen eyes, but we never saw anything. One night our entire household was awoken to my sister screaming, and we raced into her bedroom. I've never been so scared, sir, as I was certain someone had broken into our house and was trying to murder my sister. My frantic father was trembling as he loaded his rifle, and we all rushed into her room. Sir, I've never seen my sister so frightened in all my life. Her face had grown an ashen white colour, and there were red claw marks around her neck, as if something evil had been attacking her violently, like a savage mountain lion or something with claws. My father asked her what the heck had happened. She told us that this evil, insidious woman from the graveyard that she'd seen the week prior had been hovering above her and trying to strangle her to death. She said she tried to fight the demonical entity back, but was completely powerless to do so. It was as if her body froze over like a block of ice. We all believed her because our house had become so menacing in the past few days after her macabre encounter. The long and the short of it, sir, was that the house was cleansed and blessed, and the medium who visited our home told us that my sister had brought that demonical entity back from the graveyard. Oh, it was the most awful thing, sir. She said that the entity was very, very dangerous and could potentially have killed my sister.
Now that is a ghost story, Cole, of note, said Mr. Anderson, looking rather impressed. Did you manage to eliminate the spirit from your home, may I ask you?
Oh, yes, sir, we did. The heaviness in our house lifted, and everybody felt it immediately, sir. It was incredible. Needless to say, my sister never went back to that Pacific graveyard, but she still visits other graveyards, which my mother's not best pleased about.
And who can blame her? Reflected Mr. Anderson. Thank you for that very interesting story, Cole. I think we all enjoyed it, said Mr. Anderson. But now it's beddy byes.
Everybody groaned. Can't we stay up a little longer, Mr. Anderson?
Absolutely not, he chided. We have another exciting day ahead of us in the morning. I want you to team up with your partners again and look for something in nature of interest to you that we can discuss, and it can be anything from a rock to a flower.
In the twinkling of an eye, we were all sinking into our sleeping bags, and our minds were drifting off to the world of dreams. And the next morning we awoke to the smell of bacon and eggs filling our campsite. Mr. Anderson had prepared us a sumptuous feast and was cooking for 20 hungry boys, which is no mean feat, let me assure you. But as usual, he excelled himself. We piled our plates with lots of bacon and scrambled eggs, beans and mushrooms, which we washed down with fresh orange juice.
Now off with you, said Mr. Anderson, handing us each bottles of water. Do not wander off too far from the camp, and bring back something very interesting, will you? There's a lot out there, so no excuses.
Matty and I decided to walk to the further edge of the prairie, while the other kids were taking walking trails up the higher elevations. I could tell that the prairie stretched back quite a way, and I liked the open space. The wild flowers and the pretty butterflies darting from one flower to another really intrigued me, so I decided that this was the way we should go. Let's go this way, I urged Matty. Should we not have taken the hiking trail, said Matt, like the others? What are we going to actually find on a prairie? Lots, I should imagine, I said. What exactly are we looking for, asked Matt. Anything we find remotely interesting from nature, like a flower or a pine cone. Anything that intrigues us in some way. It can't be that hard, surely. Matty and I began scanning our surroundings as we meandered through the long grass. All of a sudden I tripped over a rock that was lying submerged beneath the undergrowth, and I let out an agonizing cry as I went flying along the grass and falling on my side, where I could tell that I'd seriously broken or sprained my ankle. I tried to get up, but the pain was excruciating, and I could feel that my ankle was throbbing and pounding, and even when I got up, I could barely walk. What the heck did you do? Asked Mac, looking rather vexed. I tripped, I told him. The grass was so long I failed to see the rock jutting up in the ground. Not to worry, he reassured me kindly, lifting up my right arm and guiding me gently with one hand, where I hobbled towards an old tree trunk. You sit over there, he said. I'll go and find Mr. Anderson, but I might be quite a while, so hang in there tight. He might have gone up the trail with the others. I nodded as I watched my friend retreating from whence we'd come and resigned myself for a bit of a long wait, but I sat back to enjoy the perfect view and watched the pretty prairie butterflies darting from one delicate spring flower to the next.
It was an exquisitely beautiful day, and I could hear the sounds of tweets and warbles across the valley. The soft shafts of sunlight lit up the areas of the prairie in a gentle, resplendent light, and there was a soft breeze blowing that caused the prairie flowers to sway to the right like tiny dancers. Suddenly everything became very quiet for a moment, as if a moment in time had been but frozen like a picture on your television set that you pause for a moment. In the twinkling of an eye I detected this very weird, rather peculiar smell, and the only way I can describe it to you is that someone had not had a bath for a considerably long period of time and was rather sweaty and niffy. I then heard the sound of heavy feet moving across the prairie, and then I saw him. I had no idea what he was, but I knew at once that this was no bear. As I sat on the edge of the prairie, under a tree, I was nonplussed and bedazzled by what I was observing. So much so, in fact, that for a moment I never even considered my own vulnerability, or the very possibility that I could be in very grave danger. If I was seen by this apex predator, I was in no doubt that I would be. My fear was suspended by total intrigue and fascination as I contemplated what on earth this extraordinary creature actually was. Could I have just observed an unidentified species not yet discovered by science, I wondered? Even if indeed this was the case, I highly doubted that anyone would ever believe such a seemingly incongruous, erroneous story, as witnessing this peculiar critter in our reality seemed preposterous enough. The colossal, Herculean-sized creature engendered the primate qualities of the great ape, but also the humanoid influences of a man, and both those characteristics were clearly ingrained in its biological makeup. It was covered in long flowing dark hair, with overlong arms and very powerful legs, with a ripped muscular V-shaped torso, with gargantuan-sized shoulders that merged into a streamlined waist. The head was rather like a dome that sat directly on top of his shoulders like a boiled egg in an egg cup, for I did not behold any visible neck. The critter was easily 7 foot tall, 500 to 600 pounds, and 3 foot wide, and was lofty, powerful, strong, majestic, and exceedingly graceful. In total horror and disbelief, I beheld this awesome beast gliding towards me, swinging his arms backwards and forwards, as though he was marching, and he moved so seamlessly and flawlessly, with large 5-foot strides. In that second I became so fearful, and my heart began to pound violently in my chest, and my breathing intensified rapidly. How could I escape this creature? I could barely move myself, and my ankle was aching. It was too late, because he was now standing only yards away from me, and judging by his bewildered, befuddled expression, he was as surprised to see me, as indeed I was to see him. He stopped still for a moment and just gawked at me through his dark treacle eyes that seemed curious and inquisitive. It was almost as if he was perturbed as to why I was sitting on my own in this vast prairie. He looked at me as if he was scanning my very soul. I felt as if he could read my thoughts and my mind, and that was very unsettling and discomposing. "Please don't hurt me," I kept begging in my heart. "Please, please, please don't hurt me." I just sat there under the tree, eyeballing this creature, and it felt like time stood still, as if the clock of our world had decided to keep the hand on one point for a little longer. The moments that unfolded before me were so surreal, as the creature just locked his gaze with mine, and I struggled to look away. It was that intense. To my amazement, the creature then turned away and began to move past me, gliding through the wooded area where he moved through the trees with such a flawless grace. How can something that size, that balances on 2 legs, move his body with the ease of a ballerina and the dexterity of a gymnast? It defied rational explanation. I knew where he was, as he was climbing up the mountainous ravine, because every time he moved, the trees would sway with his body. I breathed a huge sigh of relief when he was gone from my sight. Oh my God, what did I just see? On reflection, now that I look back all these years later, this critter didn't actually display any form of aggression towards me. To cut a long story short, I was evacuated to hospital, where it was ascertained that I'd only just sprained my ankle, but the doctor assured me that sprains can sometimes feel more painful than breaks. I did tell my best friend Matt what I'd seen, but I could tell by the expression on his face that he thought I'd really seen something else like a bear, and he didn't really believe me. All these years later, I know what I saw, and it was a Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, when Uncle Teddy died, it was tough on me and my mother. He was all the family we had left in the world, as the older generations in our family had long since passed away, uncles, aunts and grandparents. My family had a history of heart attacks, as if it was written in our DNA, as clearly as the writing in a book, with the ominous warning words promptly informing us that this is the way we would ultimately meet our end. But it wasn't anything to do with our DNA. We all unequivocally knew this. Put simply, it was down to the Sinclair family curse. One by one in our family, after people hit their 60th birthday, things went steadily downhill from thenceforth. We would lose our loved ones as fast as the plates being smashed at a Greek family wedding. Only a moment before, the family member would be fine, boasting excellent health, when suddenly they would clutch their chest, reach out for a wall to steady themselves, and then they would slough to the ground like a dry, crisp autumn leaf and float away in the wind in much the same way. It would seem my Uncle Teddy could not escape the wrath of this formidable, indiscriminate family curse, as 2 days after he turned 60, he was sitting at a watering hole in town, drinking a beer. Witnesses said he suddenly put down his beer, growing a pale white colour. He then clutched his chest, collapsing onto the floor in a crumpled heap. People were stunned when they realised he was dead. Now my mother, at 58 years old, was nervously waiting in the wings for her turn to come next. Like standing reluctantly in the back of the queue, with butterflies flapping in your belly, to take a ride on a roller coaster, but only my mother did not want to take this ride, for there is no fun procured from being next in line to receiving the damning effects of the Sinclair family curse. Uncle Teddy's death was hard on us, me in particular, for after Uncle Teddy died, there was just me and my mother left. When she was gone, I would be orphaned in every sense of the word, with no surviving family members left on the entire planet, and that was a bitter pill to have to swallow. I would become like a lonely barren wilderness, where rain never fell, and where the sun scorched the earth without apology, a soulless place that would only ever flower if I married and had children of my own. I had to consider the very real infelicious ramifications that the ill-omened Sinclair family curse could be cast upon my own children if they should be birthed into this world. Would they be afflicted by this harbinger of doom and fall under its weighty consequences? Let's not kid. My family had tirelessly visited specialists over the years, had regular checkups, endured all kinds of investigative medical procedures at their own expense, and nothing was ever wrong with them. There were no telltale arrows that pointed to heart disease, as you might expect. No thickening of the artery walls, arterial plaque, blockages, high blood pressure, or even cholesterol. Most of our family members at the time, that had long since died, had been informed by specialists that their hearts were in phenomenal condition. They had been given clean bills of health. Suffice to say, those medical assurances from the establishment never gave any of the Sinclair family a moment's peace. We instinctively knew that the Sinclair curse was surreptitiously waiting in the wings, like a furtive hired assassin who had marked our lives with a red X, who was waiting to strike us down when the hands of our biological clocks reached 60. Then, with their skillful hands on the trigger, they would blow our lives apart when we least suspected it, and no coroner in the country could explain our untimely deaths. My Uncle Ted thought it was a given that he would die at 60 years old, so he was prepared for the Sinclair family curse to afflict his life. Uncle Teddy believed that the sins of the fathers were passed down from generation to generation. He told us it was called karma. You can't avoid it. Eventually it comes back to bite you, and soon it'll be coming for me. The Sinclair family curse did not discriminate or even play favourites. It had ruthlessly taken down every single member of our family, without exception. The story began in 1884. An ancestor of ours, a man called Edwin Sinclair, was a masterful highway robber, with a ruthlessly cruel reputation that followed him. It was said he wore a black velvet cloak, lined with red silk, and wore a patch over his left eye. He rode a magnificent black stallion. He would lie in wait for his unsuspecting victims, deliberately causing the illustrious horses and carriages they were driving to become derailed. They belonged to people of great means, which held the beguiling promise of lining his pockets with bountiful gain, so he didn't waste a second to unleash his wrath upon them. Like a ghost in the dimming light of a fading day, when the shadows of darkness began to slowly fall, he'd pounce like a black panther onto the unexpected travellers from out the looming obscurity, where they would discern an ambiguous silhouette galloping towards them at breakneck speed on a magnificent black stallion. Things happened so speedily that no one reacted in time with any self-defence, for most were immediately frozen by an incapacitating fear. Edwin Sinclair dismantled their carriages. Wheels would come off and roll across the open prairies. He stole all their loot, usually leaving no witnesses behind. Without even an ounce of sober compassion, he'd plunge his large, razor-sharp knife straight into their hearts, one by one, while they begged for their lives. They would clutch their chests, keel over like limp rag dolls, flopping onto the ground, and finally dying. It was said they would give Edwin this pleading look, as if they were saying, "Why would you do this to us?" Edwin had no mercy on any of these sorry people that he brutally attacked, for his insatiable greed was never satisfied, for a man who has wealth still never has enough, as the desire for more and more and more becomes like an itch that needs to be scratched. Let's just say the horses, the goods, the money, the gold and jewellery were greedily snatched by Edwin, who was so savage he'd cut off the dead people's fingers if he couldn't remove the rings they wore. People would know the signature of this highway robber, as missing fingers on the victims of these attacks became commonplace. Edwin grew very rich from his exploitation of the well-heeled travellers on the road, who never saw him coming, and even if they did, they seemed incapable of reacting in time with any form of self-defence. Some say Edwin began to enjoy the life of a one-eyed bandit, so after he turned 60 years old, which was a long life for many people in the 1800s, he collapsed on a street corner, clutching his chest and dying at once. Uncle Teddy believed the weight of what Edwin Sinclair had done all those years ago, the cruel, savage way he had killed his victims, had left an indelible imprint on generations of the family bloodline, where the karmic debt would need to be paid back in full for the lives that had been so callously lost. When we reached 60 years old, much like the awful moment when Edwin plunged the knife into the hearts of his innocent victims, members of my own family would likewise experience the powerful force of an invisible blade piercing through their hearts so viciously, to replicate what Edwin Sinclair had done those many years ago to all his sorry victims who were now extracting their ultimate revenge on the highwayman's family bloodline. I often wondered how many of us would have to die this way when we finally turned 60 years old, before the karmic debt was finally settled. Of course, if we told people about our family curse, no one would believe a word of it. Life didn't work out like that, they would say. But they had no idea what they were talking about. Similar curses were found all around the world, even in ancient Egypt, when tombs of the pharaohs were disturbed. It was claimed, whether archaeologist or grave robber, anyone who entered the tomb was afflicted with the curse of death, illness, and extreme bad luck. By all accounts, even after the autopsy on my Uncle Teddy, that my mother had arranged to seek answers to our many questions as to why he died, the coroner's words confirmed our very worst fears. "I do not know what caused Mr. Sinclair's death," my mother had been told. "I found nothing to explain why his heart suddenly stopped. Your brother's death is an enigmatic mystery that makes no sense at all. There is no rational physical explanation as to why he died so suddenly. But when I did examine his heart, it was in perfect condition. But there was a peculiar mark on his heart that looked suspiciously like a stab wound, but it hadn't been pierced. It was more like a birthmark of some kind. Profoundly odd. Never seen anything like it before. His death is a medical mystery. It's unexplained.
I would describe it as adult sudden death syndrome.
You see, Kat, my mother told me, it's the same with every single Sinclair death. The very same birthmark is described every time on every one of our family members' hearts. I mean, what are the chances of that? It's the spiritual marking of Edwin Sinclair's sharp blade. These coroners can never give us a reasonable explanation as to why anybody dies in our family. I'll be the next in line, my mother told me. I've got 2 years left to go, and then I'll be a goner like the rest of them. She spoke with a resigned acceptance, like someone who's had a cancer diagnosis and is being told they've only got 2 years left to live. Nonsense! You're going to live a long time, I told my mother, my heart heavy, knowing that her stabbing words were profoundly true. I had prayed tirelessly that the karmic debt could be lifted and forgiven. Why should we be responsible for what Edwin Sinclair did so long ago? I was sorry for the unfortunate victims of his violence. I was sure my desperate pleas to God for our transgressions to be forgiven had fallen on deaf ears, and that God was not listening. It wasn't easy living with the looming dark shadow like this cast over our lives. But my optimistic Uncle Teddy would make light of it. 60's not too bad an innings. It could be a lot worse. And let's face it, we all have to die sometime, don't we? I knew he was right, of course, but in my heart I rued the day that Edwin Sinclair had ever been born, thanks to the chaotic pandemonium he'd left behind him after he drew his very last breath. Uncle Teddy had never been married. He seemed to enjoy living the reclusive single life, although he was by no means a reticent, retiring or shrinking character. On the contrary, he was larger than life, dynamic, colourful, effervescent, a charming, bubbly person, as fun as a bottle of French champagne. The locals in town adored him. He always brought smiles to people's faces and was a breath of fresh air to the community that made the world a richer place for having known him. Uncle Teddy did not conform. He didn't fit into any slot. Everything about him was unique. My mother said that even as a child on the beach, Uncle Teddy had rejected the traditional bucket and spade that every other kid was using to make sand castles on the beach. From a young age, he'd do things differently. That was who he was. He'd come to the beach with some of my grandmother's cake moulds and design his very own individualistic castles in the sand. Uncle Teddy adored the home he had designed and created ingeniously, with the help of an avant-garde architect, which he painted in a bright purple colour that he called the castle. He always said that a man's home is his castle, hence the name Castle was born. I had enjoyed spending much of my childhood at the castle, where it was just me, my mother, and my Uncle Teddy. The castle was an architect's idiosyncratic creation that poked fun at classic symmetrical designs and failed exponentially to conform to the status quo, or even the traditional stereotypes of your prescriptively average home that was methodically designed to be harmoniously uniform and pleasing to the eye. The castle was like a loud, almost rude piece of contemporary artwork that would disturb your senses, poke fun at the rigid, stiff, regimental sequences of conventional house design, and laugh in the face of the structured, systematic way of doing things. The castle was unorthodox, beyond the realms of what you would consider proverbial architecture. When you first saw it, your eyes would likely pop out of your sockets and your mouth drop wide open, and you would possibly say, "What the hell?" The castle embraced the word different with a swaggering, haughty pride, as if it knew that it was special, individualistic, eccentric, one of a kind, for there was no other house quite like it anywhere, and that was the whole point of it. My Uncle Teddy wanted to live in a house like no other. The castle proudly boasted windows of all shapes and sizes, quirky arched corridors, high ceilings, huge open fireplaces, interesting nooks and crannies. But the pièce de résistance was the towering watchtower, which rose up on the side of the house like a purple lighthouse, where you could exhaust yourself climbing up the narrow wrought-iron winding staircase that never seemed to come to an end. It was in this very special place that you were privileged to view the countryside for miles around and be inspired by its prepossessing, arresting views, where you could see the viridescent undulating valleys, Uncle Teddy's black and bay American horses frolicking happily in the pastures, and the tall lofty trees of the woodgrove that sprawled out over many miles, along with the distant hazy silhouettes of the mountains. Ostensibly, Uncle Teddy, who rebelliously spit on the world's stiff-necked, punctilious way of doing things, would never conform to regular fashion. He would always wear bright, colourful paisley jackets, scarves and pants, and eclectic glasses in a plethora of geometric shapes and colours, so everyone could see him coming, for there was nothing tame about my unbridled uncle, who was loved by so many because of his differences. When I was growing up, there were whispers around town that Uncle Teddy was asexual, as he had no interest in forming any long-lasting intimate relationships with either sex, whether it be male or female. He possibly had zero sex drive, but he had friends by the bucket-load, as everyone appreciated his eccentricities and his very infectious sense of humour, which would make many people double over with laughter. I guess you could say the castle superbly mirrored my uncle's unique individuality, and for that reason alone I loved the place with all my heart, as it was the quintessential reflection of Uncle Teddy's gregarious, flamboyant personality. Me and my mother were sharing an apartment in Manhattan together, when we were unfortunately informed of Uncle Teddy's tragic passing. We had not visited the castle for many long years, as Uncle Teddy regularly came up to New York instead, to stay with us sometimes for weeks at a time, and to enjoy fabulous shopping trips to Macy's. Sometimes we went off on holidays together, the three of us to exotic locations around the globe, often financed by Uncle Teddy, who was generous to a fault. Me and my mother were particularly close, as my dad had died when I was only 4 years old, from a pulmonary embolism, after taking a long-haul flight from America to the other end of the world. But as to where that was, I cannot remember, nor can my mother. After Uncle Teddy's funeral, we decided to remain at the castle indefinitely, to sort out through some of his stuff. He had a rare collection of books and priceless artifacts that he had collected over the years, from his exciting travels around the world, so we couldn't just throw everything out. We had to sift through it all with a fine tooth comb, in case we stumbled on anything of value. My mother believed we could tone down the castle, remove the lurid bright purple paint, so that the property became more desirable to more avant-garde property buyers who were looking for something a little different. It would not be an easy house to sell, but the purple colour might scare some potential buyers off. "You just need the right buyer, Mrs. Crawley," my mother was told by the estate agent Philip Meyer, who thought the castle was absolutely magnificent. "If you paint the castle white, or a very attractive off-cream colour, it could be exceedingly appealing, and the property itself, with its large expanse of land, rolling hills and sumptuous wood groves, is a buyer's dream." So it was decided after much deliberation that me and my mother would spend the next 3 months sorting out the castle. We would move in there for a while. I will admit I had mixed reservations about returning to Uncle Teddy's rural town, where I hoped I'd never run into the likes of Louisa Farrell ever again, for there was a raw history between us that had soured our once perfect childhood friendship. I couldn't forget or forgive what she did that fateful day, all those years ago. The possibility of running into her in town left my hackles rising, but I assured myself that maybe she had married and long since left town, and that thought consoled me greatly, for I clandestinely hoped I'd never ever lay eyes on her again. But little did I know that my hopes would be dashed, and Louisa would tarnish the canvas of my life by reappearing like a broken-down cuckoo clock that one day suddenly works, and out comes the cuckoo. No one knew why the two of us had fallen out, and they never would know, for some secrets have a tight lid on them, like a bug you might put into a mason jar with holes at the top that no one can unscrew. It would seem our secret was one of those cloak and dagger ones that no one would ever know about, not even my mother or Uncle Teddy, when he was alive. I could never bring myself to tell anyone what had happened to me that fateful, inauspicious day. It was far too distressing and upsetting, and it hurt too much to talk about. I remember I first met Louisa when she was trespassing on our land, having accessed our property through one of the woodland trails at the rear. She lived in the farmhouse next to Uncle Teddy's. Let's just say a bird on the wind had told her a young girl of similar age to herself had moved into the farmhouse next door to hers, and that thought had brought a glimmer of hope into her otherwise monotone life. Louisa had been a late lamb in her family, an unexpected child that arrived serendipitously, with no advance warning. It would seem her older siblings had long since left home, and so for a young girl in a farmhouse all alone, who found the company of her very regimental, stiff-necked parents ridiculously mundane and stifling, she was eager to meet me, in the hope that we might soon become solid friends. She had liked the castle the moment it had been erected, as the allure of my Uncle Teddy's home represented for her a bright colour on a dull page of grey paper that grabbed your attention and generously offered you the promise of something that smelt distinctly like excitement, a certain breakaway from the monotonously dull, predictable certainty of everyday life, as she had known it back then. I remember the day I saw her, a startling bright flash of white peeking at me from behind the tree in our woodgrove. I was sitting on the steps of the front porch at the time, enjoying the feel of the sun caressing my shoulders with its congenial warmth. I was wearing some rather snazzy denim shorts, a pretty pink t-shirt with lacy sleeves and pearly buttons down the middle, along with a strappy pair of diamante sandals that glittered like gold on my feet, a gift from my Uncle Teddy, who could not resist buying anything sparkly. He was like a magpie in that regard. My mother and Uncle Teddy were incredibly close. On this occasion they were chatting away in the kitchen garrulously. I could hear the sing-song expressive dramatic overtones of my uncle's theatrical voice. "Oh, my darling," he'd say to my mother, "you should see what Mrs. Shapiro was wearing in town today. That woman is so dreadfully dull. I swear to you, grey and white is the sum total of her washed-out wardrobe. The poor woman was mortified by my dream coat of bright colours that I wore to town today. I think she was getting blind-sighted by all the colour staring her in the face. She told me that I looked like a parrot. I sensed she was not being complimentary to me when she said that." He laughed. You could hear the tinkle of my mother's laughter. "I don't blame her, Teddy. You and your colour. You're bound to be quite terrifying to a tamed woman like that, whose life is so predictably monochromatic, and you come along with your blazing colours to upset the scenery. It's got to be a shock for a woman like that." "Well, in that case, remind me never to invite the woman over to the castle for dinner. She might have a heart attack if she saw that I painted it bright purple." "I'm sure she's heard about it by now," said my mother. "The castle is the talk of the town. No property like it anywhere." I was absent-mindedly shelling peas on the porch, and the reflectant white of what seemed like a dress or shirt that I'd seen peeking at me from behind the tree had caught my immediate attention. What was that? Was someone watching me, I wondered? My childlike curiosity was tickled. I promptly put my bowl of shelled peas down on the step and went to investigate the strange anomaly. That was the first time I ever laid eyes on Louisa. I was 10 at the time. "Hello there. What's your name?" "I'm Louisa," she said shyly. "I live in the farmhouse next door." "Oh," I said, looking surprised. "Well, why were you hiding from me?" "I don't know," she said. "I guess I'm shy. I just wanted to see if it was true that somebody my age was living next door." "If you like," I said, "you can help me shell peas, and then we can play together." Her face had lighted up like a Christmas tree. "You're nice," she said. "I never thought you would be nice. My dad says people from New York can be very stuck up and full of themselves." From that moment on, Louisa and I had become inseparable, until one day, 5 years later, something went terribly wrong. And all these years later, the memory of that day could potentially make me break out in hives, as me and Louisa had never spoken to each other since. So 15 years later, when me and my mother had arrived back in town, I was doing a food shop. I scanned the aisles of the supermarket, dropping the items me and my mother needed into a trolley,
You know the sort of things: loo rolls, shampoo, soap, flour, butter, sugar, tea bags. The list goes on. I industriously beavered my way towards the shortest queue that I could find, my trolley heavily weighted down with an excess of shopping that made me look as if I had a family of 12 hungry kids to feed back at home. I was concerned over the shopping in my cart, my eyes hovering over everything to ensure I hadn't forgotten something. That was when I barely noticed the skinny woman standing in front of me. She was wearing a dark green coat and busy hoisting large containers of milk onto the counter. I barely even glanced up at her, as I was preoccupied by the list of things I needed to do, that unrolled in my mind like lengthy scrolls. I would possibly have not recognized her at all if it hadn't been for the pointed shape of her nose and the familiar sweep of her very distinctive brown chestnut hair that was held back in a ponytail with a velvety black ribbon that I would have recognized anywhere. That was how Louisa had done her hair 15 years prior, and her hairstyle had not changed much. Surely not, I thought, staring disbelievingly at the woman. It can't be her, I thought. It can't be. I watched as the woman's arms offloaded bottles of peanut butter, chicken breasts, potatoes and Coca-Cola, and it was only when the job was complete she happened to briefly glance up in my direction. At first her skimming was brief, but then she held my gaze, and her eyes widened. I could swear she looked frightened, as I'm sure her memories of our last time spent together leapt into her mind like an obnoxious bad smell she didn't want to remember. I felt as though electric currents were spiralling up and down my body. My skin began to crawl, as if I'd been attacked by a hive of red ants. I stood there gawking at her for a moment. It was as if there was a huge gulf between the two of us, and we were staring at each other from opposite sides of the globe, with only a stiff, unyielding silence between us. But that was soon broken when Louisa's lips quivered and she finally said, "Oh, Cat, how nice to see you. I would have recognized you anywhere. You haven't changed at all. I had no idea you were back in town." I tried to smile warmly at the woman, whom had once been my best friend, but try as I might, the elastic tug of my lips refused to oblige, as memories of what Louisa had done that day, all those years ago, came flooding back like a cruel reminder. It was hard not to hate her. There was a huge part of me that wanted to lash out at her and extract my revenge, but instead I remained stoically still. "I'm back for 3 months or so. With my mother. We're staying at Uncle Teddy's house. He died, you know." "I know. Very sad. Many people in town were very devastated. He was quite the character, wasn't he?" "That he was." "Have you been?" I asked. Of course I had no interest in how Louisa was. I couldn't have cared a brass farthing, but sometimes out of pure politeness, asking someone how they are is what naturally tumbles out of your mouth, as it did mine, without restraint. She cocked her head and said, "Oh, you know, I have my good days and bad. I have an autistic child. He can be hard work. It's difficult at times." "I'm sorry," I said, rather shocked that Louisa was being so candid with me, as if for once she was actually wearing her heart on her sleeve. I'd always known her to be unforthcoming and very secretive as a young girl, and getting anything out of her had always been like extracting blood from a stone. "Oh, don't be," she said. "It is what it is." She released a heavy sigh. "We have to take what the world throws at us, don't we? And sometimes it's not terribly pretty." Was that a barb aimed at me, I wondered? As if surreptitiously buried beneath her cloak and dagger words was a clandestine message, especially for me, spoken with silent, inaudible words. "It happened. Get over it. You overreacted at the time. You were the one that blew our friendship up, not me." I nodded my head in agreement. "You're right. Life can be tough." "You can say that again," she said. "So you're here to sell the castle, is that right?" "Something like that," I said. Louisa raised an eyebrow and managed an insolent smirk. "Well, that's not going to be easy, is it? Most people don't want to buy a bright purple house, do they?" The spiked jabs of her discourteous words and insinuations pierced me hard. Was there any need to be so presumptuously rude, so disrespectful and unkind? "I thought you liked the castle.
I said defensively. "You said you liked it as a child. You liked how it didn't conform to stereotypes." "I lied. You have to admit it. It was way too over the top. I mean, come on. Who lives in a mansion with a watchtower?" She smirked in a condescending tone that made my blood boil. In that moment I wanted to pounce on Louisa like a black panther and go for the jugular, but I resisted and managed a stiff, watery smile. Louisa opened her large brown leather bag, pulling out a green wallet. She fumbled inside for her credit card, which she presented to the cashier, a young woman in her early 20s with short-cropped brown hair, done in a pixie-style haircut, and large blue eyes heavily lined with black coal pencil. She was blowing bubbles with her bubble gum and looked incredibly bored. She took Louisa's credit card, running it through her system, and then finally handed it back to her, with a very disinterested look on her face. "Well, good luck," said Louisa, turning to me briefly for a second, with a churlish, rather triumphant look on her face. "I think you're going to need it, trying to sell that eyesore of a place. I'm glad I'm not in your shoes, that's all." I could not believe she'd actually said that to me. She hadn't changed after all these years. Her icy cold heart had not managed to defrost or thaw, like the old turkey at the bottom of your freezer, that is as solid as a cement brick. "It's good to see you again, Kat. I'm sure I'll see you around." There was a smug, self-satisfied look in her eyes as she marched off defiantly with her trolley, as if she'd thoroughly enjoyed plunging a dagger into my heart and seeing me squirm like an octopus at the end of a fisherman's spear. I think she got exactly what she wanted, because I did squirm. Louisa didn't care about hurting me, like she'd done all those years ago. It was clear to me she'd only cared about one person, and that was herself. Things had not changed in that regard. You would think after 15 years of not seeing each other, the woman would have mellowed, and an autistic child would have softened some of her hard edges, made her into a more compassionate human being. But it seemed that she remained as heartless as ever. I stood there staring after her, in confounded disbelief. Had she really said that to me? Talk about kicking a dog when he's down. I was still grieving Uncle Teddy's tragic death, and she had the audacity to describe the castle as an eyesore. How dare she? Tears burnt the back of my eyes, and very nearly threatened to pour down my cheeks. I gallantly fought them back. I knew Louisa would be delighted if she thought she'd made me cry. An unquenchable anger burned through my veins. I could feel my cheeks growing hot, and my face flushing red. I knew Louisa's words were designed to rile me up. She wanted to rattle my cage, cause offence, and ruffle my feathers. I remember her clearly saying as a young girl, "I love the castle. It's like a fairy tale, isn't it? A place of real magic." But now she had retracted her words and called Uncle Teddy's fairy tale an ugly purple blot on the landscape. The cashier cleared her throat. "Never mind her," she said to me. "She's like that to everyone around here. Nobody likes her in town, you know. I think she hates everyone. She ended up giving birth to a child with issues. She thinks that everybody else has it easy compared to her. So she just lashes out at people like a belligerent dog. She told the pastor in town she hated God, as God played favourites and she wasn't one of them, and he was punishing her all the time. I think if she had her way, she'd drop her autistic child like a flat pancake on anyone who'd have him. She resents the child, you know. You can see it in her face. I'm sure he can sense her indignation. Kids are clever, you know. They know when they're not wanted. Louisa thinks everybody is out to get her. My mother's a nurse. She's seen capricious behaviour like this before. Self-pitying people who think life has treated them unfairly and are begrudging because of it. It's like they think no one else has it tough except them. I think that's why Louisa's so spiteful, putting people down all the time, hurting them. It makes her feel better about herself. My mother says it evens the score for her. She's hurting, so she decides to hurt someone else, and that makes her feel so much better. So if she was rude to you, don't let it get you down. She's not a nice person, period. The cashier blew a pink bubble, which popped with a loud smatter against her face. But she retrieved it with her tongue and happily continued to chew away while she ran up my shopping. "Is she really that horrible to everyone?" I asked in surprise, unloading my shopping onto the conveyor belt. "I thought I was the only member of that exclusive club. We had a big falling out 15 years ago, you see. This is the first time I've seen her since then. I'm back in town. I haven't been here for years. At one time I considered Louisa my very best friend, but not any more." The cashier pulled a face. "You're kidding me, are you? You were actually best friends with Louisa? I'm surprised you had any friends at all. Don't kid yourself. I've been working in the store for 5 years now. And believe me, if anyone in town is upset, you mark my words, Louisa is likely behind it. She's upset a lot of folk here, you know, with her brusque, uncouth manners. She told Mr. Rankling that he looked so old, like a shriveled-up tortoise. I mean, you might believe that's true, but you don't say that to someone, do you? She hasn't got any boundaries because she doesn't respect people's feelings. She can be indelicately graceless and uncouth, believe me." "Maybe she's got the hide of a rhinoceros," I said. "She was a bit like that when she was younger." "That's an excellent way to put it. I like that. The hide of a rhinoceros. That's Louisa for you," said the cashier, whose name was Gemma. "Oh my God, you're not," she asked me suddenly, looking at me through her blue eyes that grew wider and wider. "Are you Teddy Sinclair's niece? You're not, are you?" I nodded. "I am," I said. "How do you know?" The cashier's face lit up like a Christmas tree. "Oh my word, it really is you. I heard you and your mother were coming to town, and now you're here. That's so brilliant. Oh, I loved Teddy Sinclair. Your uncle was the coolest man I've ever known. Everyone around here adored him. He was quite the sparkling, effervescent, flamboyant character, dressed to the nines in dashing theatrical clothing. I remember he invited the townsfolk to the castle for a barbecue once. Oh, we had the best time ever. People still talk about that party now. Everyone was dancing under the moon till the early hours of the morning. Oh, and that house! It was like something out of an enchanting kid's fairy tale book. I remember asking my mother if that was the tower where Rapunzel let out her long golden hair. She giggled. My mother said to me, "That's right. This was Rapunzel's castle. How did you know?" And I believed her for a long time, you know. "You liked the castle?" I asked her. "Oh, you kidding me? It's the best house in these parts. I like something a little bit different, you know." I thanked the kind cashier profusely and hurriedly went back to the parking bay to offload my shopping in the trunk of my mother's green Land Rover Discovery. As I drove back to Uncle Teddy's castle, the truck rattled precariously along windy dirt roads. Its heavy-duty tyres seamlessly rolled over some of the craggy, uneven crevices and pitted potholes in the rough, rather stony road, with the occasional buoyant, bumpy jerk. My knuckles were clenched to the steering wheel so tightly I could actually see their whites. The affronted anger I was feeling was coursing through my veins. As I soberly reflected on Louisa's discourtesy at the store, it made me seethe. How I wished I'd never met that woman. I wish I could go back in time, to when I was sitting on the porch step, shelling peas all those years ago. I would have told her to "Go away! You're trespassing on private property." I should have said that. Instead, in my naive ignorance and callow innocence, I had magnanimously invited her into our home. Louisa had become like a prominent, very special member of our family, the sister I'd never had. Our family had been so good to her, and Uncle Teddy's unfailing generosity had lavished on her so many gifts her own parents weren't willing to give her, from a horse to a fabulous sooty bicycle. But today in that grocery store, she had called my Uncle Teddy's home an eyesore. How dare she speak so unkindly of my generous uncle, after his tender kindness and genuine concern he'd extended towards her all those years ago. It would seem her audaciously cheeky attack on Uncle Teddy felt like a personal, thorny attack on me. I barely remember that drive back to the castle, after that supermarket shop. The wet logs of my anger had been fueled by dry kindling, and my burning inflamed fury had been ignited like a raging unquenchable fire. My thoughts went back to that inauspicious day that had soured my friendship with Louisa for good. For so long I had buried that clandestine secret, rather like a squirrel's stash of acorns hoarded away for the winter months. Now it was being brought out cruelly, like a dusty box of Scrabble that had been left in the attic for far too long, and had not been played with for years and years. Slowly the box is opened, the dust wiped away, the cobwebs discarded, the pieces scattered. I tried to scrunch my eyes tightly shut, but instead I find myself staring unwillingly at the pieces. I begin to resurrect that day, all over again, from its grey pitiful ashes. My blood runs cold. Seeing Louisa again had revived those harrowing memories, digging them out of their safe place. Memories I had successfully put to sleep for good and euthanized, but now, despite my very best efforts to fight them off like an attack of hornets, I was grudgingly playing them back in my mind like a lucid movie that I was uneager to watch. But try as I might to obliterate my account of that bodeful day, it all but refused to go away, and stuck to my mind like a hardened chewing gum under your desk that you simply cannot shift. I found myself going back to that day and reliving it all over again. It had started like any other day. That's what they always say on the day when a disaster is about to ensue. No one ever saw it coming. It was certainly like that for me and Louisa. She had arrived at my home, and we had both decided to go for a walk by the stream in the woodgrove. We were about 15 years old at the time, and were very preoccupied with the subject of boys. We'd gone upstairs to put makeup on each other, which Louisa had to remove before she went back home, because if her mulish opinionated father saw her wearing makeup, he'd do his nut. For some reason he thought a young teenager wearing makeup was sending out the wrong signals to boys in town, who'd clearly get a distorted impression of his spotless daughter, and believe her to be a girl of low moral standing. "Makeup at 15 years old is ridiculous," he'd claim. "Do you really want to look like a tart?" Louisa and I were happily laughing and chatting, making each other's faces up. She was trying on some of my clothes. She loved the extensive variety of clothes in my wardrobe, as Uncle Teddy would buy me really glitzy fashionable stuff that Louisa's parents would probably regard as frivolous, impractical, and quite ridiculous for a 15-year-old girl to have in her wardrobe. But Uncle Teddy believed in being flamboyant. "I'm so jealous of your wardrobe, Cat," she'd say to me. "Do you mind if I wear your silver T-shirt today? It's an amazing colour." "Go ahead, wear anything you like." I was very pleased to share my wardrobe with my best friend. I happily watched Louisa put on my sparkling T-shirt, along with a pair of my zooty denim shorts and my silver sneakers. I did think she looked amazing. The clothes she normally wore were so incredibly dull. "You look great." "I do, don't I?" said Louisa proudly, examining her reflection in the mirror from every side, with an expression of satisfaction on her face. "Too bad I'll have to change before I go home. If my dad saw me wearing this, he'd think I looked like a slag. I'd never hear the end of it. I wish Bobby Fairfield could see me like this. He never ever looks at me. I think he likes that girl, Kathy. I mean, I'm much prettier than Kathy, aren't I? But he never ever gives me a second glance. If he saw me wearing this silver T-shirt, he would look at me. I know he would. But my mother always makes me wear boringly practical clothes in town that make me look like a boy. Do you know I don't even own a dress? That's not normal." I scrunched up my face disapprovingly. "Why is your dad so straight-laced? What's wrong with sparkling clothes?" "I think my dad thinks that if I wear stuff that draws attention to me, that I'm doing it on purpose to get noticed by all the boys, and he thinks that that will make me look cheap." "So does he think my Uncle Teddy is cheap because of the loud clothes he always wears?" I asked. "That's different, and you know it is. Anyway, my dad loves your Uncle Teddy. Everybody does. But he doesn't see the loud way he dresses as cheap because he's a man, and that is different. But if a woman dressed like Uncle Teddy, he'd say she wanted to be the centre of attention." "That's ridiculous," I said. "It's called freedom of expression.
That's why Uncle Teddy dresses like he does. That's why he built the castle. It's called expressing yourself. I'm not even sure he wants to draw attention to himself. I just know he loves colour. He likes being dramatic and theatrical and being different, and there's nothing wrong with that. Try telling my obstinate father that. He'd never listen to you. I tell you what, let's get out of here. It's stuffy in your bedroom. Let's go and talk by the stream in the woodgrove. It's a beautiful day. After the cold winter we've had, it'll be great to sit by the water. It's a long time since we last did that. I agreed. It indeed was a beautiful spring day in Colorado, with the Russian hawthorns, mountain ashes, coffee trees and service berries alive with blossom, tangled in between cottonwoods, junipers, log-pole pines, quaking aspen trees and spruces. My uncle's woodgrove was luxuriously furnished with an eclectic mix of trees, some tall, slender, verdant and lofty, others sculptural, theatrical and dramatic, all as individual and unique as Uncle Teddy was himself. It was a fabulously fine day. The sky was a cup of blue, without a cotton candy cloud in sight, and the rolling landscape was upholstered with a plethora of luxurious emerald quilts that was spread out resplendently across the countryside. In the distance you could see the undulating valley and the silvery silhouettes of the mountains smudging the skyline with their watercolour-like impressions. In the meadows, my uncle's black and bay American quarter horses frolicked away happily under the twinkling light of the morning. As two teenage girls, we didn't walk to the forest, we skipped, our buoyant, enthusiastic bodies bouncing in our sneakers, our senses fully engaged in the marvellous scents, sounds and feel of the forest. For us it was escapism in every sense of the word, as if we were being thrillingly dragged away from our regular cycle of existence and entering into an enchanting, bedazzling world that spinned on its own axis. Many people ridicule the word magic, say it doesn't exist, but I promise you, magic is real. My Uncle Teddy's woodgrove was magic. You felt when you entered the woods, especially in spring, with the show of Virginia bluebells, violets, wild geraniums and trout lilies, bursting rambunctiously through the dark earthen soil, as if they couldn't wait to splash the landscape with their sparkling, vibrant colours. I always felt I'd entered an illusory, dreamlike existence when I entered those woods. The canopy of the trees permitted soft prisms of pretty sunlight to dance onto the floor, in a soft gossamer light that seemed to cast shimmering glazes over everything, as if it had been touched with fairy dust. The birds tweeted and chirped in their positions high upon the trees. Me and Louisa ambled on the soft earthen ground towards the stream, our slender bodies brushing lightly against ferns and rambling foliage that sometimes tickled our bare legs. We could hear the obstreperous stream before we even saw it. It was ironic we chose to come here to talk, as the water was so incredibly loud, like a noisy cafe where you cannot hear each other think, as our voices were literally being drowned out by the noise of the water. I think we falsely assumed we were going to talk, but that never really happened for us when we sat by the stream together, with a pile of stones in our laps that we'd gathered in our hands to throw into the water. It was very hard not to be transfixed and beguiled. It was as if we became caught up in the moment, as if you were vibrantly living in that very second, when all other considerations were cast aside. Even the boys we both fancied had been forced to take a back seat for the moment. It would seem the water had a way of expunging busy thoughts and passionate preoccupations, so that you could let go and become one with everything. Louisa sat on our favourite very smooth rock that was shaped like a king's throne on the water's edge, our arms folded around our knees that were tucked up against our chests. We stared at the water, watching it ebulliently galloping over the rocks at a frenzied speed. All of a sudden, the cheerful birdsong in the forest just died. It didn't dissipate. It stopped at once. And the only sound we heard was the thunderous noise of the water crashing against the rocks. But beyond the water, everything was stiffly silent. Even the trees became rigidly still and stoic, basking exceedingly uncomfortably in this uncongenial stillness that had descended across the woodgrove like a creeping tenebrific veil. Even the wind had become restrained from blowing, as not even a faint suggestion of a breeze whispered through the trees. The shafts of sunlight that moments before had ebulliently bounced through the branches of the trees had all but diminished, and the former golden glaze had been confiscated cruelly by this darkness. The forest became steeped in a bodeful, monotonous, coffee-coloured haze that I'd never encountered before, as if someone had switched down the dimmer switch and wilfully expunged the light. I suddenly got the overwhelming sense that something or someone was watching us. I could tell that Louisa felt it too, when I glanced up briefly at her face. It had become a ghostly white colour, and her eyes had grown as wide as saucers. I was sure I could see fear in her eyes, and certainly if I observed my own in a mirror, I'm sure they would have conveyed the obvious angst that I was beginning to feel, as an icy cold chill descended down my spine, as if a snake was crawling down my T-shirt. "Something's watching us," she whispered. "I think we need to get out of here." I glanced around the woodgrove, my heart pounding violently in my chest, more furiously than the powerful jetting streams of water that seemed subdued compared to my thundering heart. I'd never felt such an irrational fear like this before. Granted, I couldn't see anything, but the sense of a dreadful foreboding was all-consuming. It was like I knew that something was there, even though I couldn't see it. Its eyes were burning into me, as if searing into my skin with red-hot coals. I knew something was there. I could feel an evil that had rudely entered our enchanted world, like an unwanted impostor that had no right to be here, for even the birds sensed it didn't belong. But whatever it was, we couldn't see it. I began to physically shake as I rose reluctantly to my feet, but Louisa remained seated on the rock, her eyes cautiously scanning the woodgrove for any signs of obvious movement. Finally, her eyes spontaneously lifted upwards towards the oak tree on the opposite side of the stream, and when she looked into the higher branches, I heard her audibly gasp, "Ah!" I followed her gaze, and that was when I saw it. My first thought was, this just can't be. It can't be. It was standing there on the branch, basking in the pleasure of our abject horror, thoroughly enjoying the terror that coursed through our veins, eating our fear like a delicious, delectable aperitif at a state banquet. I have no idea what this thing was, but believe me when I say to you, it was not welcome in our world. It did not belong here. It looked like something that had been purged from the portal of the underworld, where the souls of the damned surely reside. I knew when my eyes were cast on this thing that I was staring into the eyes of evil itself, an evil so profound you could actually feel it. The creature was 7 foot tall, built like a human being in its physical stature, but that is where the similarity begins and ends, for his face was like that of a wolf, and his eyes the colour of blazing red traffic lights. The creature was covered in a short, thick black hair, but there were patchy areas on his skin that suggested he was suffering from mange. He had hands and feet, with razor-sharp claws attached to the ends, and a long tail that seemed to swish around his body in agitation. But it was the grotesque smile he gave us that scared the living daylights out of me. It was a hungry, I-want-to-eat-you kind of smile. His teeth were like long canine daggers. There were 2 rows of them, while a globby drool, the texture of aloe vera gel, dribbled from his gob, as if he was salivating over us. The creature seemed to be swaggering on the branch like an inebriated drunk, backwards and forwards, and then it jumped off the branch like a tabby cat, with a similar resilient buoyancy, and before I knew it, the creature had jumped into the stream and was running towards us. "Run!" I screamed. "Run!" I've never felt such a gripping terror like I did then. My adrenaline response did not come my way, in the way that I would have expected it to. My legs that were failing to operate properly had become like unobliging concrete blocks beneath me. I felt as if I was awkwardly treading water, as I tried so desperately to run away. Louisa screamed, Her voice seemed to carry through the forest like a shrill ambulance siren. I could smell the stench of rancid, decomposing flesh and death and decay getting closer and closer to me as feet pounded towards us at a rip-roaring speed. We were no match for this creature, and we knew we awaited a doomful outcome. That was when Louisa, who was running by my side, but wasn't as fast as I was, pushed me over so hard that I fell into the creature's path, while she quickly hightailed it out of the forest, leaving me to the mercy of this hideous beast. My friend had literally thrown me to the wolves in order to save her own skin. I was now a sitting duck to this predator, a guaranteed meal for a grotesque beast. I had fallen on the ground. I was struggling to get to my feet. My hands were badly grazed. And then there he was, throwing himself on top of me, pressing my body down to the ground, his hungry jaws reaching for my jugular. At first he sniffed me. He licked my neck with his long, smelly tongue. And finally I could feel his teeth drilling into me. He was about to tear my neck to shreds. I remember I wiggled and fought back as much as I possibly could to escape the wrath of this creature, but his hold was so forcefully powerful, and his claws dug into my skin. I remember scrunching my eyes so very tightly, knowing that my imminent death had arrived. I just hoped it would be over quickly, when all of a sudden huge rocks were being flung at this creature from the trees. One hitting him so hard, he let out an agonizing wail. He released his grip on me and began to growl at the offender who had come to my rescue. The creature was so furious, so irate, he let go of me at once and went tearing after an obscure, shadowy, rather ambiguous figure that I couldn't see, giving me just enough time to escape and run back home. I had no idea what had saved my life that day, but whoever had flung rocks at the creature had provoked him to anger, and that had saved my life. I think in the weeks that followed, after that god-awful event, I was so traumatized that I spoke not of the harrowing details to anyone. I hid the bite marks on my neck from any intrusive prying stares with a scarf, and wore a skirt for over 2 weeks to conceal the nasty scratches on my legs. I covered my body in disinfectant and tea tree oil, and I'm glad to say nothing became infected, as I would have had a lot of explaining to do, and I was not desirous to tell anyone about the wolf-like humanoid I had encountered. I could see at church the following Sunday Louisa's mouth hanging open in astonishment when she saw me. She couldn't believe I was still alive. She had expected the creature we had encountered to have eaten me alive. It seemed that as long as she was fine, that was all that mattered. She had no shame. I knew in that moment we could never be friends again. Even when she had run back home, she had not told anyone what had happened in the woodgrove. She hadn't called any adults for help. Instead, she had left me to the mercy of this wild creature. I remember we gave each other dagger-like stares from opposite pews, and although no words were communicated or articulated between us, the stares said it all. We were no longer friends. We were enemies now. I do remember overhearing my Uncle Teddy and my mother discussing me and Louisa and the bedraggled state of our friendship together, as if they couldn't comprehend what had caused our calamitous fallout. "I have no idea what's gone on between the both of them," said my mother. "They were the best of friends, Teddy, but they've had a huge fallout. I can't think what it is. They refuse to speak to each other and even look at each other any more. It's such a dreadful shame. I can't think what could have happened." Uncle Teddy, who was the eternal optimist, laughed. "I bet I know what this is all about. It's bound to be over a boy, isn't it? They probably like the very same young man and have fallen out over it because they both want him. You mark my words, they'll rekindle their friendship once they've lost interest in the boy. Girls can be exceedingly competitive, very nasty and jealous at times. You know what you were like when you were a teenager." "Thanks, Teddy, for that. I'm not sure I was such a jealous teenager as you claim. But I hope you're right." My mother had put her hand on her heart and looked reflective. "No, it's not that, Teddy," she suddenly said vehemently. "I wish it was, but I have a sneaking, unsettling suspicion that something really bad happened between the two of them. and I have a profound sense that their friendship has soured for good. I have a sense that it's finally over." "I hope you're not right about that," said Uncle Teddy. "That would be a travesty." You may wonder why I never told Uncle Teddy or my mother, my closest friends in the entire world, what happened to me that fateful day. But there are some things that you just can't talk about, some things you're reluctant to share, and I'm not even exactly sure why. It wasn't because I might be ridiculed for what I'd seen by people who were likely to dismiss my outlandish account. Ironically, that was not my concern or botheration. I would not have cared if people doubted my story, for I would know it was true, and that was all that mattered. It was something so much deeper at the time that it inclined me to seal my lips for good. It was like a searing deep hurt, an open seeping wound that needed a band-aid at once, and sharing my story would be cruelly ripping off that band-aid and causing it to bleed all over again. For me, the only way to successfully heal was to pretend the event had never happened, to bury it away under lock and key, and forget all about it. It was hard to come to terms with what Louisa had done to me. The images of her pushing me towards the grotesque creature, as if to say, "Eat her, not me," tormented my darkest nightmares. I'd never have done that to her. I would have probably saved Louisa before myself, as I would do for anyone I loved, so her cruel, callous behaviour had soured our friendship for good. So having seen her at the store after 15 long years brought the anger tumbling right back. Even when I returned to the castle, my mother noticed my lugubrious melancholia, and she knew at once I'd bumped into Louisa. Oh dear, I knew this would happen. I wish you could tell me what happened all those years ago to sour your friendship with that girl. I take it you saw Louisa in town. I guessed by your expression at once that you'd run into the ghost from your past. So you knew she was still living here? I asked, appalled. Why didn't you warn me? Your uncle told me she'd married a local boy in town, so I knew she lived here. What was his name again? Oh yes, it was Bobby Fairfield, I think. I hate to tell you this, Louisa, but they're still living in the next-door farm from us. Louisa's parents downsized, you know. They're now living in Maine, I believe. They sold the farmhouse to her husband, Bobby Fairfield. So she's still living next door. Bobby Fairfield, I gasped. She married him? You're kidding me? No, I'm not. I remember she had a crush on him when we were 15 years old. She claimed he never gave her the time of day, and now they're married. She certainly has her way to get what she wants, doesn't she? Well, they're married, certainly that, said my mother. But things haven't been easy for the couple. They have an autistic son, you know, who gives them a great deal of stress from what I heard. Louisa's also not desperately popular in town these days. She seems to rub people up the wrong way. Why does that not surprise me? I said. 3 weeks later, me and my mother had been working very hard, boxing up all Uncle Teddy's stuff that we were going to keep, and giving the stuff we didn't want away to charity. Once Uncle Teddy's house was painted a white colour, I was surprised how incredible it looked against the splendid viridescence of the countryside. I was in no doubt the place would sell easily once we put it on the market. In the last 3 weeks I had seen Louisa around town, even caught brief glimpses of her autistic son, but I avoided her like the plague. I will admit that after my mortifying event in the woodgrove with Louisa 15 years ago, I had never since ventured into my Uncle Teddy's woodgrove again. I had lost all my courage. It seemed to have permanently been tarnished with the horrifying memories of that hideously brutal creature. I began to realise that if I didn't go for a walk in the woodgrove, that I'd never be able to put the event behind me, or clean the slate, so to speak. So on one late afternoon, I told my mother I was going for a stroll to get some fresh air and to stretch out my legs, as I was feeling cramps from having sat on the floor all day, packing boxes. It was a magnificently beautiful afternoon, not too hot, not too cold. The temperature was perfect, the sunlight warm and convivial on my shoulders. I ambled through the knee-high grass of the meadows where my Uncle Teddy's horses used to happily frolic. I made my way with a reluctant trepidation towards the woodgrove. I drew in a deep breath. My heart began to vigorously pound in my chest, and a tiny little voice whispered encouragingly in my heart, You can do it, Cat. You can do it. I know you can. When I entered the woodgrove, I felt as if I was being welcomed back into this enchanting, tranquil wonderland, as if all the trees remembered me and were delighted to see me again. I could hear the pleasing twitters of the birds high up in the trees, and the peppering of light that showered the forest floor was exactly how I remembered it. Magical. The forest smelt of moss, wild flowers and pine, and I felt as if I was being held in the arms of the natural world, and being kissed lovingly by the cool breeze that spirited its way through the trees, brushing me gently with its fresh whispers. The trees swayed and jiggled very slightly, and suddenly I forgot all my anxiety, as if it was all but a bad memory that I had long since abandoned. Soon I could hear the familiar sounds of the water crashing over the sculptural rocks, and I moved eagerly towards it, sitting back on the comfortable king's throne-like rock that I had sat on over 15 years ago. It rekindled pleasanter memories spent with Louisa, when we had made paper boats in the water and paddled in the icy stream, trying to catch the silvery fish that darted by. I glanced briefly at the old oak tree, where I'd seen that horrendous beast. In the 15 years since, the tree had grown even more magnificent. I gathered some stones together from the pebbly beach and collected them in my lap, throwing them into the water like coins in a wishing well. I watched the rock slowly drop into the water, and that was when I suddenly felt myself being pelted by acorns. I turned around sharply to see a Bigfoot staring at me brightly, with warm, congenial eyes that were so incredibly kind that any fear I should have felt was promptly confiscated by an overwhelming sense of intrigue. The way the Bigfoot was looking at me was as if she was greeting a long-lost old friend that she hadn't seen for a very long time, almost as if she'd known me for all my life. The Bigfoot was 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, tall, lofty, powerful, magnificent. She was covered in dark brown hair, with an auburn hue, with a face so incredibly human, it almost took my breath away. But what happened next, I certainly did not expect. She walked over to me and tapped me confidently on the back, and then she spoke to me in a strange language that was immediately translated into my head. Ikita fokolopa, hikan sakwelana, hisilonosho. I hoped you would come. I've been calling you. I wanted to say goodbye to you before you left this place for good. I've been overseeing you since you were a little girl, but I doubt you remember me. Akatwati amokotonolo, hafakana kulakwa, isikatonolo. I'll never forget that day. The thing nearly killed you. I attacked him with rocks, you know. He came after me, but I killed him. My mouth dropped open. It was you, I gasped. You threw the rocks at the monster that tried to kill me. She nodded. Itwa, I did. Bicatolono, abantikalakwa, isifon chokonosi. Before I go, she said to me, tell your mother the curse has been lifted off your family. She will live long. The Bigfoot patted me on the back again. Kotwanti. Godspeed, she said. Itala kotwa, ikachonolo. It's good to see you. And then she was gone like a bullet into the forest. Suddenly I remembered when I was a young girl, how safe I'd always felt in Uncle Teddy's forest. And now I knew why. Who knew that a Bigfoot had been watching over me? I remember returning home, feeling as if the weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulders. Suffice to say, we did sell Uncle Teddy's castle to a prominent artist who fell in love with the place at once. Enchanting, he had said. I feel as if I've stepped into a child's fairy tale. I saw Louisa a few times. We'd never spoken over the years, and never will. While I forgive her for what she did, I have not forgotten, and some friendships are not worth rekindling. Me and my mother returned to Manhattan, where we currently share an apartment together. We remain the very best of friends, and yet even so I have not shared my secret with her. I have never wanted to marry. Perhaps some of Uncle Teddy's individualistic eccentricities have rubbed off on me. My mother's 60th birthday came and went, and at 75 years old, she's still going strong. So I can safely say that at long last, the Sinclair family curse has been well and truly lifted. But with me not having any children of my own, I guess I've brought the bloodline to an end. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners.
What is it?
I asked, staring at the ancient stone structure, covered with moss and lichen. Was it what I thought it was, I wondered? Surely not. I rubbed my hands up and down the bumpy, rounded stone walls, and peered curiously inside, down the long, dark tunnel that led deep into the ground. My cousin looked at me, amused, and chuckled. "You mean you don't know what it is?" he asked. It was almost as if he was thinking I must really be quite the most stupid person he'd ever encountered on the face of the earth. He tried to suppress his self-satisfied smug grin as he looked at me with a quizzical raised brow. My cousin Tom was a good-looking boy. I liked the fact he was blindly oblivious to his obvious attractiveness, but I knew back in New York all the 16-year-old girls in my class would fancy him rotten. It was unfortunate that I couldn't like him like that in a romantic capacity, as he was my cousin. I had not seen my two cousins in many long years. I only had a vague reminiscence of a beach holiday I had been on once with them as a family, when I was merely 7 years old, but that was a long time ago. I had an ambiguously blurred recollection of that time, although I do recall screaming loudly on the beach after being stung by a bluebottle, and it appeared that they also recollected that event all too well. When my cousins were told I was coming to stay with them on their farm, both Tom and Ruth had said, "You mean the cousin that screamed when she was stung by a bluebottle? Is that the one that's coming to stay with us? The one who can scream like a banshee?" "That's the one," my aunt had giggled. It would seem at least I had made some kind of impression on my cousin's memories, although I cannot say it was actually a good one. At the time I was staying with my Uncle Philip Baldwin and his delightful family at his Georgia farm, where they grew large sprawling orchards of the sweetest peaches you've ever tasted. Philip was my mother's older brother, and I had come to their farm for spring break, while my parents sorted out their personal issues. My mother had sat me down on the velvety emerald green quilt of her king-size bed, and taken my hand in hers. I could see tears misting up in her eyes, and seeing her like this really unsettled me, and scared me half to death, as growing up my parents were like closed books that you could never read, as they adopted a stiff upper lip approach in regard to their emotions, and were determined to never fight in front of me. Sometimes parents think their children naively don't know what's going on, when the reverse is actually true. I'd often laid in bed at night, hearing them arguing, and if one of their voices got too raised, I'd hear one of my parents saying, "Shush! You don't want to wake up Nim. She might hear us fighting." My name was Naomi, but it had been shortened to Nim, as I think over the years Naomi became a bit of a mouthful. In truth, even though my parents tried to hide the tempestuous stormy seas they were sailing together in their relationship down some choppy courses, I would have been as blind as a bat not to notice the subtle bells of discord ringing in our home that were clamorously loud to me. Ostensibly, I hadn't seen any affection exhibited between either of my parents for several months now, and when my father said something that irked my mother, she'd roll her eyes in the back of her head, as if she thought he was the most boring man on the planet. I'd been unfortunate enough to overhear my mother discussing my father with her very best friend, Hilda. "But he's so dull, Hilda. I mean, how could I possibly live with the man for the rest of my life? It's like watching paint dry." I knew Hilda came from a divorce background and had very strong opinions about divorce and how it could ultimately destroy the dynamics of the family and have a very negative impact on the children. I'd often heard her say, "There's no problem that can't be fixed. The people need to reconnect and fall in love over again. It's not that hard, you know." It was hardly a surprise that Hilda was a successful marriage therapist, with an illustrious reputation behind her. She claimed to have saved hundreds of marriages from the brink of disaster, and so many of her nearly divorced clients over the years remained happily married many years later, and were ever grateful to Hilda that they hadn't ultimately given up on their marriage. Some of them had gone so far as to renew their wedding vows. "I'm so grateful, Hilda, that you saved our marriage," she was often told. "I couldn't imagine us living apart. You showed us how to reconnect again, and I'm more in love with my wife than ever before," she was commonly told. "Sweetheart, come and sit down with me on the bed. I need to talk to you for a moment,"
Now, I've organised for you to go and stay with your cousins in Georgia. You do remember Ruth and Tom, don't you? Your cousins. Remember that fabulous beach holiday we went on together? Surely you haven't forgotten. I recall you got stung by a bluebottle on that beach. I shrugged my shoulders. Barely, Mum. The last time I saw my cousins was when I was 7 years old. I'm 16 now. I haven't seen them for 9 whole years. It's an awfully long time. They're like strangers to me now. And more's the pity, said my mother. I blame myself for that. There really is no excuse with being out of touch with your cousins for so long. I'm appalled with myself for being so disconnected to my brother. The family always graciously invited us over for Thanksgiving and Christmas every year. But we've never gone to stay with them, have we? Your father was so insistent we went to Maine instead to stay with his parents for both Thanksgiving and Christmas, which is absolutely ridiculous. Instead, we should have stayed with my brother's family from time to time. We should have alternated those arrangements every year. The good news is now you'll have the chance to reconnect with them, with your cousins, your uncle and your aunt. Now, won't that be nice? You'll be staying in that resplendent old Georgian house, Foxmall Hall, where I grew up as a young girl. I don't believe you've ever seen it. It's a magnificent place. Rolling hills, flowering meadows, orchards of the most vibrant peach trees, and incredible lofty wood groves. You'll just love it there, she said enthusiastically. For a second I saw a wistful, nostalgic look flicker over my mother's face. Her skin flushed a pink colour. It had a sentimental, radiant sheen about it, almost as if she was remembering a fleeting, evocative childhood memory that brought her a great deal of pleasure. You'll love the place. The house was built in the late 1700s. And growing up there, I never felt alone. The house felt alive, if you know what I mean. No, I don't know what you mean, I asked her nervously. What do you mean? My mother shrugged her shoulders, cocking her head to one side reflectively. Well, you know how it is. Historic homes, they have an energy about them, don't they? It's like the indelible memories of the past are imprinted on the place, as if all the previous residents that lived in the house that are long since deceased never truly went away and are still hanging around. You're freaking me out, Mum. You're not talking about ghosts, are you? Not exactly, dear. Well, not really, said my mother reflectively. It's hard to explain. You'll understand exactly what I mean when you see the house for the very first time yourself. Think about it. If you walk into a recently built modern home that's been renovated, that no one has ever lived in before, there's a vacuous energy to it, an energy that needs to be filled, and you can sense the house is empty, much like a brand new diary that you've never written in before. Many people like it when they buy a house like that, as it's a clean slate for them that they can write their own chapters in, from start to finish, create their own story. When you visit a home steeped in a rich, vibrant history, like Foxmall Hall, it's like looking at an old, tattered, well-worn diary that is full of hundreds of fabulous stories. And when you enter that house, you feel as if the house has lived before. You can sense those stories that have been absorbed by the very foundations of the house, written in the walls. There's a fullness, a completeness to the house. Do you understand what I'm saying? And while people continue to live in that house, more chapters continue to be written. I wasn't sure I did know what my mother meant, but I dutifully nodded my head. I think I know what you're saying, I said. Well, why are you sending me away to stay with my cousins? I don't understand. Well, there's no easy way to put this, sweetheart, but things have been a bit difficult between me and your father lately, she confessed. We've been married for over 26 years, you know, and sometimes relationships need an overhaul, just like our house sometimes needs another new coat of paint, and a few new fixtures and fittings to keep it current, and to bring along great refreshment, if you know what I mean. I was surprised how candid my mother was being. She was normally so cloak and dagger about her relationship with my father. I looked at her bemused. What do you mean by overhaul? You're not getting divorced, are you?
I asked this, my heart sinking, suspecting that this was the real reason my parents were actually sending me away. I had dreadful visions churning around in my head, like the frantic clothes in a spin-drying cycle, whirling around and around and around, about returning home after spring break, to find a brand new life awaiting me, where my parents now lived in different apartments, and I'd be forced to spend the remainder of my school days, unhappily being tossed like a pancake between two separate locations. And there was no maple syrup-like reassurances or frothy whipped cream to sugarcoat such an awful state of affairs that I hoped would not soon become my lot.
No, nothing of the kind, sweetheart. Don't think like that. Well, at least I hope it won't come to that. She raised her brow. Our relationship's grown stale, that's all. Sometimes your father bores me rigid, and I think I frustrate him as I don't always do things the way he likes. He can be quite punctilious, you know, and some of the things I do annoy him greatly. I'm going on a marriage retreat that Hilda recommended for the both of us. It's supposed to revive flagging marriages. Hilda thinks we owe it to each other to give it a go. And you know what? I believe she's absolutely right. I don't want to give up on your father just yet, but he does so exasperate me sometimes and can be so dreadfully dull. And over recent months we've been bickering quite a lot. But you still love Dad, don't you, Mum? But of course I still love your Dad. I love him more than anything else in the world. But sometimes I don't like him that much. He can get on my nerves a teensy-weensy bit. But that's to be expected after being married for a long time. Our marriage needs a nip here and a tuck there, I expect, like anything else in life that's lost its buoyancy. For example, an old boat that needs repanelling. We're no different. I'm sure things will work out very well in the end for the both of us. I don't want to divorce your father, and the marriage retreat has a high success rate, I believe. It's in France, of all places, so we're going to the City of Love, and that's a good start, because France is the home of lovers. How does Daddy feel about this marriage retreat? It was his idea, sweetheart. He said he'd do anything in the world to make our marriage work. We really love each other, you know, but our marriage has weathered some knocks and shocks along the way that need ironing out. As Hilda says, it would be an awful pity to throw our marriage away, and she's right. In truth, as annoying as your father can be at times, and I mean annoying, I can't imagine my life without him. We're like a pair of old slippers. We belong together, even if we're a bit scuffed and worn out. We've been getting on each other's nerves recently, bickering over nonsensical things. And we need to get out of those very bad habits and learn to begin to appreciate each other. So that's why we're sending you to Georgia to stay with your cousins. From what I'm told, they're very excited to see you after so many long years. I gather your cousins remember you on that beach, screaming your lungs out because you were stung by a bluebottle. I flushed with the shame of that memory. Well, I'm glad they remember my screams, I say sarcastically. Oh, Mum, please don't make me go. I'm scared of moving in with strangers. I mean, I don't know these people anymore. It's been such a long time, and I'm naturally reticent by nature. My mother ran her hand through the mane of dark curls on my head. You're always so sensitive, Nim, dear, she said, planting a warm, tender kiss on my cheek. I promise you, you're not moving in with strangers. You're moving in with beloved family members, and I'm sure you will be made to feel warmly welcome. My brother's family are delightful people, quite delightful, I can promise you of that. I would never send you away to be with people that I didn't doubt were quite lovely. Besides, I feel strongly that you need to become acquainted with my side of the family. It's been far too long, our disconnection. Far too long. My mother had been absolutely right about my cousin's family. They had made me feel warmly welcome, inviting me into their home magnanimously, with open arms. And they were the nicest people you could hope to meet, in every sense of the word. Oh, my word, Nim, look at you, said my aunt, cradling me in her arms when I first arrived at Foxmore Hall. She squeezed me tightly, so much so that I could barely breathe.
Her bird-like brown eyes were misting over with tears. "Oh, it's so fabulous to see you again. My, haven't you grown? The last time I saw you, you were 7 years old, you know." "Mum, of course she's grown," said my cousin Ruth, scoffing. She pulled her face. "Nim is not 7 anymore, is she, Mum?" "Of course she isn't," said my aunt. "You're right about that. Silly me. I suppose you had not grown up in my imagination, that's all. But it's so good to see you, Nim." She pointed to my cousins. "You do remember Ruth and Tom, don't you?" "Vaguely," I said, flushing. "It was a long time ago." "Well, we've been so excited to see you. We couldn't wait for you to arrive this morning. It's been such a dreadfully long time, far too long." "Who have we here?" said a tall man with sandy hair and big green eyes who entered the room with a huge beam on his face. He looked startlingly like my mother. The family resemblance was uncanny. He moved graciously towards me, throwing his arms around me in a huge bear hug. "You have no idea, young lady, how thrilled we are to see you. Welcome to Foxmore Hall. I hope you're going to be very happy spending your spring break with us. We're delighted, very delighted to have you here with us. Spring has come early this year, as you can see. So many of the trees are already in blossom. I've got a good feeling that the weather is going to be on our side. Perhaps you brought the sunshine along with you," he teased. I will admit I was in awe of this exquisite Georgian house, with its high ceilings, large fireplaces, symmetrically aligned large windows and rooms that flowed seamlessly into each other, along with a very grand ornate staircase that led up to the second floor. It was beautifully decorated with historic 1800s oils on canvas, many of them family portraits, possibly of long since deceased ancestors, who seemed to look distinguished, like people of high standing. Suffice to say, there were marvellous antiques, luxurious rugs, velvety curtains, rococo mirrors, and exquisite oakwood flooring throughout. It made me feel as if I'd gone back to the days when extravagance was highly celebrated among the aristocracy, where they were richly spoilt by the attention of butlers, ladies' maids, cooks, groundsmen, and general staff. This house was the perfect place to indulge in such fantasies, for I could almost see a flashback of earlier times being played back in my own head, like a silent movie. My mother was right. This house was like a book with many written chapters, of flamboyant stories that were written from bygone days, with a print so faint you could not see it, but you could definitely perceive it. Stories still to be written, of which I clandestinely hoped that I might appear in some of those chapters. And there was nothing empty about this house, which felt like a full-bodied red wine, with a spirited, zestful energy that was also mellow and very mature, the kind of wizened sophistication that only sweetens with age. It's almost as if the benignant, attested house was richly marinating in the variegated woody flavours of the past, and had grown up like a little sapling in the woodgrove into a tall, lofty giant, a magnificent tree. I had a sense that not only were my cousins inviting me to this benevolent home with such a genuine, wholesome warmth, but that the providential house itself was terribly pleased to see me, as strange and irrational as that may sound. I felt an immediate attachment and affinity towards Foxmore Hall, which was exceedingly bizarre, for I was not even remotely attached to our family apartment in Tribeca, which was put simply just bricks and mortar to me, nothing desperately special or sentimental. But here, this classically authentic property was drawing me into her arms like a long-lost, all-embracing friend. The stunningly traditional exterior grabbed my attention at once, with its stately, dignified appearance. I adored baronial houses like this, that made me feel that this was like a majestic, grand mansion the people in Downton Abbey would have found most satisfactory. The house was accommodating, with extensive servants' quarters to the rear, that were now gathering dust and cobwebs. But my aunt and uncle employed regular cleaning staff and a cook to manage the property's affairs, but none of those staff lived on site, as they had done so in former years. Foxmore Hall seemed to smile in the countryside, glistening brightly like a white lily, under the soft light of a spring morning, while the stone-washed grass, having been bleached by a formidable winter, was now being overtaken by the tenacious shoots of fresh green turf that was eagerly upholstering the countryside in a plethora of sparkling viridescent quilts. The house was surrounded by peach trees on one side and meadows on the other, that sprawled out into fabulous wood groves, where some of the eastern budwoods were covered in early pink bloom, and the oakwood trees were now bountifully full of brand new leaves, while the stoic silhouettes of the eastern pines, with their needled boughs, were as green as the now reviving grass, splashing the countryside with their vividly cheerful emerald coats. 2 days had passed of living in this spectacular Georgian home with my cousins. I felt as if I'd known them for ever and ever. And now here we were, standing around this ambiguous stone structure, covered in lichen and moss, that we had found in the open clearing in the woods, where alpine flowers were bursting through the grass and being industriously pollinated by bees and pretty butterflies. Tom seemed to be smirking at me. "You mean you really don't know what this is? Don't they teach you anything in New York?" he asked me. "City people tend to think they're so much better than country folk. It's a joke, when they don't really know very much." I knew my 2 cousins were thinking that this city slicker didn't know much at all, so I was determined to prove them wrong. Of course I knew what this rounded stone structure was. I wasn't that callow. "It's an old well, isn't it? A well where they used to draw water in the olden days." "Exactly right. No one is sure how old it is. They suspected it was built in the very late 1700s, but it's been on our farm for generations." "It's not just any well," my cousin Ruth explained. "It's a witch's well," she said proudly, as if a witch being acquainted with the well made it significantly more special and worthy of celebrated applause. Now it was my turn to laugh out loud. "You're joking. Did my cousins really think I was so ignorantly naive? Let's just say I presumptuously, rather arrogantly thought, coming all the way from New York, that I'd have the upper hand in that regard. People who lived in the country weren't as savvy and sharp-witted as city slickers, but I was gravely mistaken about that. Even so, both my cousins really expected me to believe that this was a witch's well, and I wasn't going to swallow that. "It's true," Ruth insisted. "If you don't believe me, you can ask my father all about it. He'll tell you the entire story. In the very late 1700s, a woman the townsfolk believed was a witch was flung down this well to meet a deadly fate. My father has heard her wailing down here. One night when he walked around the woods to investigate some strange light anomalies he'd seen in the grove, he heard this strange howling sound. At first he thought it was coyotes, but when he passed the well on the way back to the farmhouse, he realised that the wailing noise was coming from inside the well itself. Let me tell you, it freaked him the hell out. So much so, my mother said when he returned back home, he had grown as white as a sheet. All the colour had been vacuum suctioned from his face. He was shaking like a leaf. It shook him up really badly. He was sure it was the witch that he heard wailing. The haunted cries of the woman that was flung into the well by the townsfolk all those long years ago. "Oh, for goodness sake," I said, smirking. "You really expect me to believe all this drivel?" "It's not drivel," Ruth assured me. "I do think the well is haunted. I think the ghost of the witch hangs around this location and haunts the woods here. Maybe she doesn't even know she's dead. She was the lady of Foxmore Hall, you know, at one time. Our grandfather believes he's actually seen her. He says he saw the figure of a woman in black once running through the woodgrove at the dead of night. He went dashing after her. She vanished before his very eyes. He said he saw her up close. She looked like a young woman in her early 20s, with whiter-than-white porcelain skin, dark curly hair, and very frightened brown eyes. She was wearing old-fashioned clothes like they wore in the 1800s. You know, those long sweeping dresses with corsets and petticoats. He said the female portrait hanging in our entrance hall was of the very same woman he'd seen in the woods. Even your own mother knows the story, as your grandfather would doubtlessly have told her all about it when she was a little girl. I'm surprised she didn't tell you about it. It was really spooky. I understand my grandfather claimed to see the witch several more times in our woodgrove. It was like she was running for her life, probably from the townsfolk who were intent on drowning her in the well.
My cousin paused for a moment. Then she shrugged. Her pixie-like face became gravely serious. There are strange things that happen in these woods. We've seen orbs, Nim. We've heard women's screams. We've seen dark, tenebrific shadows through the trees. So something is going on in here. Those woods, they come alive at night. Everything Ruth is telling you is true, Tom affirmed. We're not making any of this up. You can ask my father what happened the last time we covered this well up. All hell broke loose around our property. We have to leave the well open for the witch so she can come and go as she pleases. So that's exactly what we do. I don't think the water down there is drinkable anymore. But even if it was, he said, scrunching up his eyes, if that witch was thrown in that there well, she has to have contaminated the water, don't you think? I wouldn't drink it in a million years myself, personally. I really didn't know whether my cousins were winding me up. I knew I had a propensity to be dreadfully gullible, but they seemed deadly serious on the matter. So I decided that I'd find out about the well from my uncle, and later that evening I broached the subject with him. It is true, my uncle told me. Foxmore Hall is the home of Mr. and Mrs. McCallington in the late 1700s. Josie McCallington was the lady of the house who was accused of being a witch. She didn't receive a very good reception from the servants, who were waiting to greet her at the door, when she arrived in the horse and carriage with her new husband Tobias, who escorted her into the house, introducing her to all the servants. She shook their hands when she arrived, like you do, here at Foxmore, but was met by a congregation of very glum, disenchanted, frosty faces who were not terribly pleased to see her, which was exceedingly intimidating for the young girl. She knew they resented her for filling Mrs. McCallington's shoes. It would take a great deal to get them on side. They already had a dim view of outsiders, and on seeing the young lady of the house who had married their master, they were less than enamoured, viewing her to be nothing more than a gold-digger, having her sights set on inheriting Tobias's vast fortune, or for herself. The staff had been fiercely loyal and devoted to the late Mrs. McCallington, who had hemorrhaged excessively during her childbirth. Regretfully, both baby and mother tragically passed away during a very tricky delivery, when the baby was strangled by the constriction of the umbilical cord. A rare condition, but less rare back then. It would seem that Tobias McCallington had emphatically decided after the death of his beloved wife Stacy, loved by so many, that he would never get remarried, as his heart was truly broken. The servants had attended to his needs in the house for many years as a widower, and were hostile towards Josie, viewing her as an outrageous impostor that was not at all welcome in the household. Tobias described his late wife Stacy as the quintessential love of his life. No one would ever be able to replace her. It was then he realized that he had no progeny to inherit his vast fortune and carry forth his family bloodline. That was when he decided to look for a wife, preferably someone young enough who was fertile to give him the son he required. It would seem that Josie's father Monty was very good friends with Tobias at the time, who was a frequent visitor to the MacNeil residence over the years, and was not unfamiliar with little Josie, as he'd been invited to attend many dinners at the residence. She had regularly greeted him when he arrived at their house, never suspecting for a single moment that one day she might be expected to marry this man. Tobias expressed to Monty MacNeil his great interest in his daughter Josie. It is come to my attention that I need to get married in order to sire a son whom can inherit my estate one day. I need a filly who is young, fertile, pleasing to the eye, and your daughter Josie has grown up to become a very becoming young lady. I have always admired her from afar, as she's got a good heart on her. It would please me greatly if you would consider persuading her to accept my hand in marriage. She'll never want for anything, Monty. I can assure you of that. I can offer her a very good life indeed. Even though I'm considerably older than her,
but I do not believe that should be an issue."
"But I don't love him," Josie had told her father. "How can you expect me to marry someone so old? He's as old as you, father. Is that not foolish? I'll be left a widow for many years once he's gone."
Josie's father sighed. "That should not be an issue, sweet pea. If that be the case, you could always marry again, couldn't you? But you will be a woman of significant means, and that is a very agreeable prospect. You need to consider your future, Josie. You could do a lot worse than Tobias. He's a good man, of noble character. He will treat you well, and when he dies you will inherit his vast estate, and that is nothing to be sneezed at by any manner of means. Furthermore, the man comes from a highly respected family name that is highly esteemed in these parts. He can guarantee you the good life that you deserve."
"Your father is right, dear," her mother had said. "All this stuff and nonsense about love, it's so overrated. If you live together, you'll grow fond of each other soon enough. When I first married your father here, I didn't like him very much, if you must know. But my parents persuaded me he was a good man, and he came from good stock. And look at us now. We have a very satisfactory marriage, don't we? I've grown quite fond of your father over the years. I've wanted for nothing. Furthermore, my womb has been very happily satisfied with 3 offspring that have blessed my life in ways I would have never envisaged. But I don't want satisfactory, Mum. I want to love the man I marry." "My dear Josie, listen to yourself. You're not thinking rationally, are you? You're thinking more like a child, not like a woman. You need to be terribly practical. You're making a decision that is going to ultimately affect your entire life. We've known Tobias for many long years, me and your father, and we know him to be a principled man of sound character. I think you would be a dreadful fool to refuse his proposal. Next time you might not be so lucky, for righteous, incorruptible men like Tobias don't grow on trees. I'm not comfortable to set you up with a stranger for marriage, and neither is your father, if I know not about his character. Look at your sister and her unscrupulous husband's great affection for the cider that stole her thunder. Your poor sister was incredibly lonely living with him, but at least after his tragic passing she has some relief. She's been left well provided for. You don't want to go down the same precarious path as her, do you, dear? If you remember, she was quite taken by the yellow-bellied Mr. Roxburgh in the very beginning, thought her heart had been struck down with an impassioned great love, but instead the unethical Mr. Roxburgh was a dreadful disappointment to her, and her knight in shining armour he most certainly was not. Too many women out there whimsically dream of a Prince Charming, but what you see is not what you always get. Many of my friends have shared this sobering truth with me over the years, when discussing their own personal relationships. Tobias has known you for years, since you were a little girl, Josie. He has developed a great affection for you, has always found you pleasing on the eye. You remind him very much of his beloved late wife, whom he treated like the perfect princess. He is the quintessential gentleman, dear, and I am in no doubt he will make you terribly happy. And who knows, in time, you may grow fond of him." "I'll never fall in love with Tobias, Mother, never," said Josie indignantly. "Nothing about him beguiles my fancy. He's far too old for me besides. I like Mr. Hugh Maynard. He's the kind of man that I could grow to love. He's only a year older than me. He's a man of sizable means, and would meet my favour well. Furthermore, when I lay eyes on him, he makes my heart a-flutter with those green eyes and curly dark curls of his. He has on him the appearance of an angel, and dimples besides. Josie, he's a very agreeable man, I will agree, but he has shown you no interest. All the women he has the eye for have red hair, do they not? I am told he has the eye for women with red hair and blue eyes. I doubt greatly that you are his type, without wishing to cause you offence."
Josie wasn't happy about marrying Tobias, but she knew her parents were right, that Hugh Maynard would never give her a second glance. Word around town was he was in love with Eloise Duncan Gray, and that woman with her long red hair had made men's knees crumble. Eloise's stunning beauty invited competition that she knew she could not defeat. How she wished she could own hair like that, locks of woven gold. She didn't even find Tobias attractive, but she firmly decided that her mother was right, that the safe option was so much better than a risky one. She had seen how her sister's love affair with the debonair, chivalrous Mr. Roxburgh had seemingly curdled from sweet honeyed milk, which invited the potential of so much promise, to sour, curdled, congenial cream that had turned rancid. So even the allure of a blemish-free love could offer her no guarantees. Nothing was written in stone, and relationships born from love were not necessarily more successful than ones entered into with a more business-like approach or formal arrangement, shall we say. She knew with certainty that Tobias would treat her terribly well, but she doubted she'd ever fall in love with the man, for he was incredibly old. She had to consider her future, and Tobias would provide for her well. Of course, when she arrived here at Foxmore Hall, she didn't receive a rapturous welcome as she had hoped. Instead, the staff were curt towards her, treating her brusquely, like an unwelcome guest, with an abruptly offhandish approach. Josie confided in Tobias that his staff had been most discourteous towards her. As a result, Tobias promptly laid off a couple that had caused his wife offence, which only served to set the cat among the pigeons and made the remainder of the staff very disgruntled. And rather than warming towards Josie, they nursed a contemptuous resentment towards her, for they felt affronted that she may choose to dispose of them if given the fancy. Soon after Josie settled into married life, the new stranger in town had certainly set tongues wagging. The townsfolk were always suspiciously mistrustful of any outsiders, and this pretty unassuming dark-haired young filly had not won over the affections of them greatly, but served only to ruffle their feathers. People in town muttered and gossiped meanly among themselves.
"Have you seen the young woman that Tobias has married? She's young enough to be his daughter twice over. There's something not right about her, marrying a man so old."
The rumours seemed to grow roots, as behind closed doors and on street corners, and on the backs of carriages, people spoke unkindly about Tobias's new bride. Josie spent much of her time sewing little dolls to give as gifts to the local orphanage in the area, but soon after she blessed the orphans with her dolls, 2 of the children died within days of each other from dysentery. Of course, the people in town did not believe for a moment that the orphans' deaths were natural, even though dysentery was rife back then. They immediately linked the sudden deaths of the 2 young orphans to Josie.
"She's a witch! I'm telling you, she's a witch!" they cried out. "She cast a spell on 2 of those children, and now they're dead. Those dolls she made them were afflicted with an evil hex. She cast a spell on them."
Worse still, one of the staff at Foxmore Hall, who had grievances against Josie, who had threatened to let her go because of her insolent behaviour towards her. So in revenge she whipped up rumours among the townsfolk.
"I've seen her myself," she lied, "with her witch's cauldron, mixing up all manner of spells. Maybe she'll put a hex on our children next, and then they'll go exactly the same way as those orphans did."
It would seem that the atrociously unkind rumours were the very kindling that was needed to spark the fire of the town's fury. One day the townsfolk marched indignantly towards Foxmore Hall, determined to put an end to Josie Macklington, Some marched on foot to the house, others rode on horseback. As they stormed to the front door, banging it loudly, Tobias Macklington opened the door, to be met by hundreds of protesting people, screaming, "We've come to get the witch! The evil, evil witch! We've come to get the witch!" Tobias was bemused. "What are you talking about? My wife is not a witch. The idea is ludicrous. I've known my wife all her life, from when she was a little girl. She does not dabble in such arts. She's an honourable woman of noble character, just like my first wife Sadie was, who so tragically lost her life in childbirth, along with my baby who was strangled by the cord. In the beginning you didn't warm to her, did you? Then she won over your affections with her good heart. Josie is like my Stacy was. You need to give the woman a chance. She's a woman devoted to our good Lord." It is with great regret that the people did not listen to Tobias Macklington. Their fury was insatiable, unquenchable. They wanted blood, and would not be satisfied until they got it. "Kill the witch!" some people cried. "Burn her! Drown her! She must die!" The townsfolk were indignant, inebriated by their own bloodlust, incapable of listening to reason or common sense. They did not consider a trial of any kind, no, not at all. They were insistent on dealing with this problem hands-on. Josie was a problem that needed immediate extermination, for they would not rest until she'd been dealt with in the manner of which she deserved. "You're all grasping at straws," said Tobias. "My wife made some dolls for the orphans out of the goodness of her heart. The orphanage was thrilled by her great generous kindness. 2 of those orphans died of dysentery. My wife had nothing to do with their fortuitous deaths. Surely you can see that. She cast spells on those dolls. We cannot allow her to harm our children. Furthermore, one of your own staff has seen her concocting all manner of spells with her very own eyes." "Whoever this member of staff is," said Tobias, "I'm appalled by his treachery. My wife is no witch. I will deal with this gossip-monger at once, for no liar can remain under my roof. My wife is innocent of all your ruthlessly cruel insinuations, which have no merit or bearing on the truth whatsoever." Tobias didn't stand a chance. Even his own staff were on the town side, and so 2 burly men pushed past Mr. Macklington in the hallway and presumptuously trotted into the parlour, where Josie was cowering in terror, knowing without doubt that her end had surely come, for the fury of the townsfolk was like an unbridled fire that could not be tamed or put out. Kicking and screaming, they dragged poor Josie out of the house, throwing a large sack over her head. One powerful man flung her on his shoulders. "Kill the witch! Kill the witch! Kill the witch! Kill the witch!" The townsfolk were crying out. "Kill the witch!" "Please, please, please, listen to me!" Josie called out. I've done nothing wrong." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I had nothing to do with those 2 orphans dying. You've got to believe me. I'd never willingly harm a child. I'm a woman of God. I'm no witch." One woman in the crowd shouted out, "Throw her into the well, so she'll drown." And that is exactly what they did. The townsfolk marched over to the well. In fact, Tobias had 2 wells at the time, and Josie was flung into one of them. At first they heard cries and screams, and then everything went very, very still. And that was the end of Josie Macklington, as we knew her. "And that's a true story?" I asked my uncle incredulously. "Poor, poor Josie." "It's a very sad story," agreed my uncle. "But remember, in those days, we're not just talking about Europe or Great Britain. We're talking about America here. and thousands of people were put to death for being suspected of being witches. They were very superstitious in those days. And for the locals, a witch needed to be exterminated, much like a rat infestation. That's how they saw it back then.
But Josie, she was innocent. There was no fair trial for her. To plead her innocence, was there? It was morally wrong. It was corrupt. Those townfolk were warped in their thinking.
People often took the law into their own hands in those bygone days. But even if there had been a trial, so to speak, it may not necessarily have ended up in Josie's favour. Even the judge might have been biased.
You've heard the whales in the well, haven't you, Dad? Tell Nim all about them.
My uncle shrugged his shoulders. Is it wise to scare our guest? We'd like Nim to be able to sleep comfortably at night, would we not?
It's all right. I'm really interested in Josie's story. Please tell me what happened.
All eyes were on my uncle. Do you mind if I smoke? He asked me.
Of course not, I said.
I'm not actually a smoker, he confessed, but occasionally I have a cigarette to be social. But I certainly need one now, talking about poor Josie Macklington. Somehow her story shakes me to the core, it does. It was such an unfortunate story, all associated here with Foxmore.
I watched my uncle light up his cigarette. He blew out a puff and sighed appreciatively.
Ah, that's so much better. Now let's see where to begin. When I was a boy living here at Foxmore Hall with my parents, my father saw Josie's ghost in the woodgrove. He chased after her, thinking she was a frightened young woman who needed his help. He described her as being as real as you and me, but he said she stopped, looked directly at him, her eyes full of dreadful sorrow, and then she disappeared in front of him. He realised she was wearing an 1800s grey gown with material-covered buttons down the central panel, long sleeves, a small waist, and a very full skirt. The clothes she was wearing were soaking wet, her hair completely drenched, and there were muddy scuff marks on her porcelain skin. She stopped, looked at him, and said,
I'm innocent. Really, I'm innocent. Why won't anybody believe me?
He had quite the shock, as he realised the woman he had seen was the very same woman in the portrait gallery of Josie in our hall, that was commissioned by her husband after she became the lady of Foxmore Hall. He claimed he saw her ghost running through the woodgrove on a few occasions, not just once, I have to tell you. More recently, possibly about 7 years ago or so, I'd been taking an evening stroll on the property myself. You see, I wanted to get to the bottom of some of the strange light anomalies that I'd see in the woods from time to time. And that was when I heard a haunting wailing sound. I realised it was coming from the well. It was a woman's frightened screams. I knew at once it was the ghost of Josie. It couldn't have been anything else. It left me feeling quite rattled.
Tell Nim about the time when you closed the well, my cousin piped.
One day when I took it upon myself to close the well, there was no point having it open. What if our cat fell down there or something? So I boarded up the well, and that night we heard something thundering around the roof, banging the eaves of the house. It scared us half to death. Whatever it was extremely angry. We caught sight of this massive, ambiguous black figure. What it was, I do not know, but we knew it was responsible for the noises we were hearing. And whatever it was furiously enraged with us, and I learnt later that it was because we covered the well up.
I was terrified, said Ruth, her eyes growing round. You knew something was out there. It was so frightening. But finally the banging stopped. But we did see a strange face peering at us through the window, with a yellow eye shine. We heard some strange grunting sounds, but then the noises stopped. The next morning we went back to the well, and all the boarding had been yanked off. It had been broken into hundreds of tiny pieces and was lying scattered all around the clearing. Some of the trees in the woodgrove had been furiously bent back. You got the distinct impression that someone was very aggrieved with us. I thought it might be the ghost of Josie, possibly toying with us because we were playing with the well that she had been thrown into all those years ago.
It was very peculiar, agreed my uncle. I mean, to just yank those boards off the well like that was incredulous. I mean, who has strength like that? I decided from then on I would leave the well alone. Some things are best not tampered with. I had an ominous sense of foreboding that if I messed around with that well, I would almost certainly be inviting trouble.
So something didn't want the well covered up? Do you think it was Josie?
I do, said my uncle. She was trapped in that well, drowned in there. I imagine if I boarded it up, she'd feel there was no way out. Maybe her spirit would leave the well at night to go exploring in the woods. Which might explain why my grandfather noticed Josie's ghostly form was soaking wet at the time. She had emerged from the well, I suspect.
When my cousin showed me the portrait of Josie hanging in the picture gallery in the Great Hall, I did a double take. I looked so like her in every regard, and even my cousin said as much. The similarity in our facial features made me feel oddly drawn to the woman. Even in the picture she looked quite sad. I imagine it must have been tough for her moving away from her loving home, into her husband's home, only to be met by all manner of prejudice and abuse. Even if Tobias, her husband, had been incredibly good to her, he'd been unable to protect her from the vengeful wrath of the townsfolk, who were determined to kill what they believed was a witch.
"She looks so like you, doesn't she?" laughed Ruth. "It's uncanny, really. My bet is if you wore her dress and had your hair pulled back away from your face like that, you could almost be her double." In the week that followed, I couldn't get Josie out of my mind, the witch, the well, and the story about her life. I was intrigued. Much like my uncle, my cousins had promptly informed me that they too had seen strange light anomalies coming from the woods, and they were scared to go out there at night, for fear of what the darkness might actually hold for them.
"Don't you want to see if we can see the ghost of Josie, like your grandfather did?" I asked, surprised at my cousins' reticent reluctance to go exploring, and their obvious lack of curiosity, which for me was most odd. I was a city girl, and far less afraid than they were of the dark. Maybe I was naive, but honestly, for two kids that had grown up in the countryside, I clandestinely thought my cousins were rather cowardly.
"Why would you want to see Josie's ghost?" asked Tom. "Do you want to be frightened out of your wits or something? I know I don't. Going out in the woods at night is a hell of a scary. Believe me, you don't want to do it. If you know what's good for you, that is. You shouldn't mess around with something you don't understand. I've been in those woods at night. I know what I'm talking about. The woods change at night. They can be foreboding and ominous, taking on a life of their own."
"My brother's absolutely right," said Ruth earnestly. "You need to listen to him, Nim. We know exactly what we're talking about. Over the years, we've seen things in that wood grove, things we can't possibly explain. We've heard peculiar sounds, strange screams coming from those trees. If you don't mind my saying, I grew up in a city, and I'm not scared of the dark. But you two, who should be a lot braver than me, are being so reluctantly cautious. That's what you expect from a city dweller, not two country folk like yourselves."
"That's low coming from you," said Tom, looking at me furiously. "Are you trying to say I'm a wuss?"
"You said it,"
came my flippant response. Tom's face grew red. There was one thing he didn't like, and that was being labelled a wuss.
"What do you really want with Josie's ghost?" he asked me again. "You do realise you probably won't even see her. Ghosts don't just appear at random when you want them to. It doesn't work like that."
"If I saw Josie, I'd like to tell her I believe she's innocent. If she's wandering around the woodgrove, she probably doesn't know she's even dead. It's so tragic. I think we should reach out to her, go to the well in the middle of the night, see if she comes out. Then we can talk to her. Psychics do it all the time, you know. I've seen it on television programmes. There's no reason we can't do exactly the same. It would be good to help her if we can. She's clearly lost."
"Are you kidding me?" said Tom, giving me a funny look. "She's dead. You can't talk to her."
"You heard what your father said. He insisted your grandfather said that Josie told him she was innocent. He should have told her that he knew she was. Maybe she's been hanging around because she wants someone to believe she's not a witch, and then maybe she can finally rest. Don't you get what I'm trying to say?"
"All right," said Nick. "We'll come into the Woodgrove with you tonight, but I can't promise you that things will pan out in the way you hope. We probably won't get to see her."
"Speak for yourself," said Ruth indignantly. "Wild horses would not drag me into the Woodgrove at night. I'm sorry, but there's no way I'm coming with you. I can't believe you, Tom. Why are you giving in to Nim's whims like this? You're upset because she called you a wuss. That's what this is about, isn't it?"
"It's not that. I just know that if I don't go into the Woodgrove with Nim, she'll probably go out there all on her own. And we can't have that, can we? It's not safe for Nim to go wandering around. I need to make sure she's safe."
"You wouldn't, would you? Go into the Woodgrove on your own?" asked Ruth, her face growing ashen. "If Tom doesn't want me to accompany him in the Woodgrove, then yes, I will go in there all on my own," I said defiantly. Ruth shrugged her shoulders. "I think I should tell Mum and Dad what you're both up to, for your own good. It's not safe for you to be wandering around in the grove at night. It's utter madness, complete lunacy."
"Sis," said Tom, growing angry, "you keep Mum and Dad out of this, will you?"
"Fair enough," said Ruth, "but don't you dare come running back to me if you're scared out of your skulls, for I will have no pity on you. Do you understand that?" It was at 12 o'clock that night that I was awoken to Tom shaking me. I looked up through half-closed eyelids that were laden down with the heaviness of sleep, to see Ruth was standing by his side. They were both wearing jeans, sweatshirts and puffer coats. "But I thought you weren't coming, Ruth," I asked her. Ruth crinkled her face in a disgruntled expression. "Do I look like I want to come out on this crazy nightly soiree? Absolutely not. But I can't possibly let you guys go out there on your own. I'd be worrying myself sick back in my own bed. So I have to come with you. Now get dressed quickly, Nim, and be quick about it before I change my mind. It's still nippy out there tonight. You're going to need your sports jacket or something like that. A parka, perhaps. You must be quiet. If Dad gets wind of what we're doing, he'll blow a fuse. And I promise you I'm not joking. You don't want to see Dad when he loses his temper." I hurriedly climbed out of bed, feeling some vague stirrings of excitement. I was secretly thrilled my cousins were coming with me on this mission, as underneath my cocky confidence was a whisper of uncertainty, a nudging doubt, a flapping flurry of flusters in my gut, as if hundreds of pigeons were shaking out their feathers inside of my stomach. It was a feeling that swung from a pendulum of yes and no's, as if a large part of me was reluctantly hesitant about leaving the house, and another part of me as eager as a boisterous dog that was gagging for a walk. Before long we were all tiptoeing down the long sweeping staircase to the lower floor. Ruth kept giving me dagger-like looks when my sneakers began to squeak. I couldn't help it. They were making such an annoying noise. The family dogs who slept in the kitchen began to bark, and for a moment I thought we were in trouble. The dogs had definitely heard us. "They bark often," my cousin explained to me. "We've learnt to sleep through their barks. If they hear a raccoon rustling around near the bins, they go ballistic, so we're used to it by now. I doubt they wake Mum and Dad up." We hurriedly put head torches on our heads, while I carried my thin, powerful torch I had brought along with me, that I charge in a wall socket. It gives an efficient light source for 5 hours. My mother bought it from me from a camping shop. Before long, my cousin pulled back the chain from the front door, and finally pushed it open. It made a loud, protesting squeak. Thankfully, the house did not have any alarm system or security that we needed to navigate our way around. The 2 dogs my uncle owned were ample security and were still barking enthusiastically. I wish to God they'd shut up. If they carry on this way, surely my uncle and aunt would realise something was up. And I didn't want to be responsible for getting my cousins into trouble. Then there we were, out in the gloomy, desolate darkness, where the icy Arctic fingers of a cold breeze blasted against our faces, searing us with its burning cold touch.
We had left the cosy comfort of the house behind us. The twilight was wrapped in the clouds of obscurity, like the stuff you pack in bubble wrap when you move home, that you cannot clearly see. It was almost as if black crayon had been scribbled over the landscape, so that the lofty trees and farm buildings seemed hidden behind this tenebrific veil. And even the ethereal moon tonight had clandestinely concealed her glorious golden disk amidst the murky cloud cover, so that her silvery shafts of light had been ruthlessly confiscated, and it seemed as if the stars had joined her in this rebellious truancy. I was glad we were warmly dressed, and that the light on our heads was sufficient to see the path ahead. But I will admit, my cocky confidence about not being afraid of the dark was definitely subdued. I knew anything could be hiding in there, and it felt as if from every angle of the woodgrove that there were eyes upon us, and this left me feeling a little discomposed. "Are you still sure you want to do this?" my cousin Ruth asked me. I nodded my head defiantly, but I wasn't really sure that I did. My former confidence had ebbed away, but I was determined to show my cousins that I was no wuss. This city slicker had conviction, and if I said I was going to do something, I would go through with it. I had inherited my father's obstinacy. Before long, we were very cautiously ambling through the woodgrove, our sneakers crunching the forest debris beneath our rubber soles, so you could hear the ground crackle, snap, and pop, like a bowl of Rice Krispies being munched between very spirited jaws. Sometimes when we brushed against forest shrubs, branches and ferns, it could make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up on edge, as if somebody was touching you. A couple of times I could hear Ruth whispering, "What the hell is that?" "Relax, Ruth," came Tom's reassuring voice. "You brushed against a branch, that's all." "I wish to God you weren't making us do this, Nim," said Ruth, growling. The lofty trees in the woodgrove whispered among themselves. Branches twisted, jiggled, and thrashed, while dark, ambiguous shadows hauntingly seemed to dance through the trees. But the bodeful, uneasy feeling that we were being watched persisted, and its impressions were most insistent. But I told myself that my imagination was being highly suggestive. Soon we had reached the well, in the open clearing, and then we walked towards it, but there were no sounds that came from the well, no cries of a woman in distress. "So what do you want to do now?" asked my cousin. "I told you I'm going to speak to Josie at the well." I moved towards the well, my cousins following close behind me. I fondly stroked the stone wall, staring down into its hollow depths, and then I called out to Josie. I don't mind admitting I did feel rather foolish, but I came here to find her, and this was the only way to get her attention. "I don't know if you can hear me, Josie, but I want you to know we believe you. We know you were not responsible for causing those 2 orphans to die in the late 1700s. You were so kind to make them those lovely dolls. It was unfortunate that the people here at Foxmore Hall blamed you for the children's death, and all the townsfolk. We know you're not a witch. You were never a witch. You're a good woman, Josie." "This is silly," said Ruth. "Really silly. Do you really believe she can hear us?" "I hope so," I said. "Let's go and sit over there under the oak tree. See if she comes out of the well." "You know what I think about this?" said Ruth. "I think it's incredibly unlikely that that is ever going to happen. As I keep telling you, this is insane. It's so silly." "Shh," I said. "Come and sit down under the tree." For a long while we waited, and nothing happened. I could see a smug, self-satisfied look developing on Ruth's face. I actually believe she was gloating. I knew when we got back to the farmhouse I'd never live this down. Tom's expression was a little kinder, but you could see the scathing doubt on his face, that I could read as clearly as a book. He thought it was incredibly unlikely that anything would happen, and secretly I believed he was actually right. And that was when we saw it. A dark figure emerged from the depths of the well, pulling herself over the stone edges and climbing out of it. It was the figure of a woman. It was Josie. I knew it had to be her. We were seeing her ghost. I could hardly believe it.
My heart was bumping against my ribs like a bedboard slamming against a wall. And that was when the ghost of Josie floated towards us, as if she was walking on air. I wasn't scared, although both my cousins were in a state of abject disbelief. I think in normal circumstances they would have run away in terror, but they were anchored to the spot. I, on the other hand, had almost expected to see Josie. I'm not sure even why, as before coming to Foxmore Hall, I had not believed in ghosts, but an inner knowing had convinced me that I would almost certainly encounter the ghost of Josie. We could see her bask in the light of our torches. She looked as real as you or me, but we knew she was like a hologram. She was wearing a long 1800s grey gown. As our grandfather had described, she was sopping wet, her tangled hair hanging in sorry limp rags around her face, her eyes almost puffy from tears, her dress soaked with water. "You believe I'm innocent?" she said to us. "I believe you're innocent, Josie. Everyone in Foxmore Hall knows you're not guilty," I told her. We could see a relief wash over her. She smiled warmly at us. "You're free to go to the light, Josie," I said. "You don't have to stay here any more to prove your innocence. We know you're not a witch." "I'm free, aren't I?" she said. "I'm finally free." She smiled at us, and we watched her disappearing into the woods, and then she was gone. "Oh, my God, we saw her ghost!" gasped Tom. "We saw her ghost!"
"I can't believe it," said Tom. "We actually saw Josie's ghost. You were absolutely right, Nim. We should never have doubted you. She needed to hear from us, didn't she? That we believed in her. She needed someone to validate her innocence." All of a sudden, a tall, dark, ambiguous figure came gliding towards us, swinging its arms backwards and forwards. And then, to our utter confoundment, he stood before us, only a foot away. We found ourselves staring up at a Bigfoot. We could hardly believe it. The night was certainly purging up all manner of surprises for us, but I'd never banked on encountering a Bigfoot. I do not know why we were not seized with terror, for indeed we should have been, for this lofty, tall, magnificent creature was impressive in every regard, with a noble-looking human face and a ponderous body that was easily as robust and powerful as any farming tractor. But it was not fear that gripped our hearts or seized our bodies with a paralysing fear, for this dignified, distinguished, extraordinary creature's eyes were filled with such a benevolent warmth, such a graceful poise, offering us an assurance that he meant us no harm. Indeed, those treacle-coloured eyes gave off a yellow eye-shine, but they were the kindest, most convivial eyes I have ever beheld. The creature himself had the energy of an angel. It was when he spoke to us in an ancient indigenous dialect that I was rendered completely speechless, especially when his virtuous, upstanding words were translated so precisely into my head, so that I understood every word that he spoke so eloquently. "Ikata likoshofa hakinatwa sikatolo bukaka ikatwane silakwa." "I'm here to thank you for what you've done tonight. You have sent the lost soul into the light. I was hoping you would come," he said to me. "We have been calling you for a long time. The young woman has been wandering aimlessly around this woodgrove for years and years and years. But today of all days, or tonight, should I say, you have led her to the light. Her husband and her father were there to greet their Imatila nakosha hilatwanisi himota likatolona imatila dilagosha ivana tswakanatalana homona kila sonofo. I saw the reunion myself. I can see into the world of spirits, you see. You can now tell your father that should he wish to board up the well, he has my blessing to do so. While she was still in there, I was not happy for it to be boarded up." "Were you the one that banged on our house, ripping the covers off the well?" asked Ruth in astonishment. "That was me," said the Bigfoot. "I'm sorry to have scared you, but blocking the well would have been most unfortunate for a lost soul. Now, if you forgive me, I must be making tracks, but once again, thank you for what you did tonight. I am profoundly grateful. I've been trying to help that poor lost soul cross over for a long time and lead her to the light, but she never seemed to see it until tonight. You were the one that showed her the light. Your words helped the chains of her incarceration finally loosen their hold on her. You told her you believed she was not a witch. She had been waiting for those words for so long. She needed to hear them from someone like you. The Bigfoot nodded at us. May the good Lord be with you, he said. And then he glided into the woods, and me and my cousins hugged each other joyfully. The forest became peaceful. The trees seemed to be jiggling in a joyful dance. The moon suddenly broke through the clouds. The stars shone brightly, and suddenly the trills of the crickets and the frogs could be heard throughout the valley, as if they too were celebrating this freedom of a once-trapped soul that had been exonerated from her label of being called a witch so falsely. Josie was now finally free. Suffice to say, I have not forgotten that miraculous night, nor will I ever, when my paradigm of the world was completely shifted. But I soon became a believer in the miraculous, for when I returned home to my parents, I barely recognized them. Their former contemptuous disregard for each other had melted away, for they were like two giggling lovebirds that couldn't get enough of each other. I have no idea what happened to them on that marriage retreat in France. But at night I was not awoken to the sound of my parents shouting and saying, "Shush, keep quiet," but more to the noise of a headboard banging against the walls, and the naughty giggles of both my parents in the throes of passion. I would smile to myself happily in that knowledge that all was well in the world, and even a broken marriage can regain its former joyful vigour. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.